In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone in Western Europe after the collapse of France. Across the English Channel, German airfields stretched from Norway to the French Atlantic coast, housing thousands of aircraft prepared for sustained operations against the island. For Germany, air superiority over southern England represented the prerequisite for any invasion attempt. Without control of the skies, landing forces crossing the narrow strip of water between Calais and Dover would collide with artillery, aircraft, and naval resistance before even reaching shore. The German Air Force assembled fighters, dive bombers, and medium bombers capable of carrying explosive loads measured in hundreds or thousands of pounds. A single Heinkel bomber could carry bomb loads approaching 2,000 pounds. Squadrons of Messerschmitt fighters, armed with machine guns and cannon rounds weighing ounces, but fired at hundreds of rounds per minute, escorted these bombers across the Channel. In coordinated formations, numbering dozens or sometimes over 100 aircraft, the Luftwaffe attempted to fracture Britain's defenses. Opposing them stood the Royal Air Force Fighter Command. The British defense network combined radar stations along the coast, ground observation posts, and fighter squadrons flying aircraft such as the Hurricane and the Spitfire. These fighters carried machine guns, capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute. Ammunition belts feeding those guns weighed dozens of pounds, and allowed pilots to unleash concentrated bursts lasting only seconds before requiring precision. Inside the cockpit of a Spitfire, climbing rapidly toward incoming bombers, the pilot felt the Merlin engine vibrate through the fuselage as the aircraft accelerated upward. The canopy rattled slightly in the wind stream. Oxygen masks pressed against faces as pilots ascended to altitudes where bombers appeared as dark clusters against bright sky. When combat began, distances closed in seconds. The air war above Britain did not consist of isolated duels. It unfolded through waves of aircraft colliding across vast sectors of airspace. Radar stations detected incoming formations, while controllers directed fighter squadrons toward interception points. Every aircraft carried fuel measured in tens of gallons that limited how long pilots could remain in the air before turning back toward base. German strategy shifted repeatedly during the campaign. Initial attacks focused on coastal shipping and radar installations. Later waves targeted airfields where British fighters were based. Bombers dropped explosives weighing hundreds of pounds onto runways, hangars, and fuel depots. The aim was clear: destroy enough British aircraft and infrastructure to erode the RAF's ability to resist. Yet every destroyed fighter could sometimes be replaced faster than expected. British factories produced new aircraft continuously. Workers assembled engines producing over 1,000 horsepower, riveted aluminum skins onto wings, and delivered completed fighters to squadrons within weeks. Replacement pilots arrived with limited experience, but the flow continued. I remember reading the daily operational summaries from RAF Fighter Command during August 1940. Each day listed aircraft destroyed, pilots killed, and squadrons scrambled. The numbers rose sharply during the most intense weeks. Yet beside those losses appeared another column: replacement aircraft delivered. The battle became less about isolated engagements and more about whether production and training could outpace attrition. German bombers faced heavy defensive fire once fighter escorts were drawn away or overwhelmed. British anti-aircraft batteries fired shells weighing several pounds each into the sky above London and other cities. When those shells detonated, fragments spread across the airspace, forcing bomber crews to maneuver while maintaining formation. Inside a German bomber approaching the English coast, crew members felt the aircraft shudder as flak bursts erupted nearby. Pilots gripped control yokes tightly while navigating through clouds of black smoke. Bomb bays opened, releasing payloads toward industrial targets, docks, and urban districts. The aircraft then turned back across the Channel, while fighters attempted to shield them from pursuing British aircraft. The campaign intensified through late summer. Some days saw hundreds of aircraft clash above southern England. Pilots returned to bases with aircraft riddled by bullets or missing sections of wing fabric. Ground crews worked through the night, replacing damaged panels, repairing engines, and rearming guns with belts containing thousands of rounds. German losses accumulated steadily. Bombers required crews of several men each, meaning every aircraft lost represented multiple trained personnel removed from service. Fighter units lost experienced pilots whose skill could not be replaced quickly. Meanwhile, British pilots could parachute over their own territory if shot down, sometimes returning to duty within days. When I examine German loss reports from September 1940, what stands out is the increasing difficulty of sustaining pressure. Aircraft destroyed in combat and accidents began exceeding replacement capacity in certain units. Missions still launched, but operational strength gradually eroded. Strategic decisions also altered the campaign's direction. German attacks shifted toward bombing cities, including London. These raids dropped thousands of tons of explosives onto urban districts. While devastating for civilians, the change allowed British airfields and radar infrastructure crucial breathing space to repair damage and reorganize fighter operations. The air war above Britain revealed how radar detection, centralized command, and industrial production could combine to resist a numerically powerful attacker. German pilots remained highly skilled, and their aircraft performed effectively in combat. Yet the system sustaining them, long flight distances, bomber vulnerability, and attrition among crews, gradually strained operational capacity. Picture a British pilot landing after a mission during the height of the battle. The aircraft's wings bear bullet holes. The engine ticks as it cools. Mechanics rush forward, carrying tools and ammunition belts. Within an hour, the same fighter might return to the sky again. And if you are listening now as evening grows quiet, imagine standing on a grassy airfield somewhere in southern England. The sun sets behind hangars while a few aircraft taxi slowly across the runway after a day of combat. The engines wind down, leaving only wind moving through tall grass near the edge of the field. This is the entire history of the Battle of Britain, the RAF's finest hour. Chapter 1. The Ruins in the Hangar. The 4th of June, 1940, southern England. The last boats are still coming back across the channel from Dunkirk, their hulls low in the water, their decks crowded with exhausted men. Most people are watching the sea. Somewhere behind them, in a brick building in Surrey, a clerk is working through a column of numbers. The numbers don't care about the boats. They don't care about the speeches being prepared, the medals being considered, or the careful optimism being assembled for public consumption. The numbers just sit there, adding up to something no one in authority wants to say aloud. Air Ministry Form 78 was the RAF standard aircraft record card, a bureaucratic document, the kind of thing that gets filed and forgotten in peacetime. It logged every aircraft, its serial number, its unit, its operational status, its fate. When an aircraft was destroyed, damaged beyond repair, or simply failed to return, Form 78 recorded the fact in a column. During the 9 days of Operation Dynamo, from the 27th of May to the 4th of June, those columns accumulated at a pace the system hadn't been designed to process. The RAF lost approximately 145 fighter aircraft during the Dunkirk operation, a figure that gets cited regularly and then passed over quickly, as though it were a price worth mentioning briefly before moving on to the heroism. But I think it's worth stopping there, not moving on, just staying with that number for a moment, because there's a complication that the brisk summary version of this story usually skips. Those 145 aircraft were not the RAF's only losses during Dynamo. Fighter Command's losses, the fighters specifically, represented less than a third of the total RAF aircraft lost across those 9 days. Coastal Command and Bomber Command, operating in support of the evacuation, between them lost several hundred more. The total RAF loss during the Dunkirk period, across all commands, was in the region of 400 aircraft of various types. When people say the RAF survived Dunkirk, they mean Fighter Command survived it, with a coherent order of battle. They don't mean the RAF came through unscathed. It didn't. The combined losses were enormous, and what remained was not a force at peace. It was a force that had just absorbed a serious wound, and was now expected to defend the entire country. By the middle of June 1940, Fighter Command's actual serviceable strength in Hurricane and Spitfire fighters, the only aircraft genuinely capable of meeting a Messerschmitt Bf 109 above 20,000 feet on equal terms, stood at somewhere around 640 aircraft. The precise figure varies slightly depending on which counting method you use. The Air Ministry's official strength return used slightly different criteria than the group war diaries, and historians have noted a gap of several dozen aircraft between the official figure and the number of machines available for immediate operations. That gap matters because it represents the difference between aircraft that were technically on strength somewhere in the system, in transit from a repair depot, waiting at a maintenance unit, undergoing acceptance checks, and aircraft that a squadron commander could send into the air, For the purposes of fighting a battle, only the second category counts. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, fitted to both the Hurricane and the Spitfire, was a masterpiece of engineering that ran, at emergency wargate power, on 100-octane aviation fuel. By the spring of 1940, the RAF had been converting its frontline fighters to run on this higher-grade fuel, which allowed supercharger boost pressure to be increased to plus 12 pounds per square inch, as against the plus 6 available on the lower grade. That boost difference translated to roughly 30 additional miles per hour at critical altitudes, which is the difference between catching a bomber and not catching it. But the fuel supply was not unlimited, and its distribution was uneven. Not every forward airfield had adequate 100-octane reserves. Some were still running 87-octane stocks, which stripped the Merlin of precisely the emergency power margin it existed to provide. This was the state of the RAF's readiness in the summer of 1940. Not zero, not hopeless, but hollower, in important ways, than the official numbers suggested. There's a training record that I find almost impossible to read without feeling something I can only describe as quiet dread. Newly qualified Hurricane pilots arriving at operational squadrons in the weeks following Dunkirk had, in many cases, logged fewer than 10 hours of solo flying time on type before being declared combat ready. 10 hours. The Hawker Hurricane was not a forgiving aircraft for the inexperienced. It had specific handling characteristics at high speed, a tendency to swing on takeoff, and gun harmonization procedures that required understanding rather than just compliance. A pilot with 10 hours on type understood the controls. He understood how to take off and land. What he didn't have, what took 30 or 40 hours of operational flying to develop, was the instinctive tactical literacy needed to survive a three-dimensional, high-speed engagement against a Messerschmitt pilot who had been flying combat sorties since Spain. When I was working through the production and delivery records for this period, I found it striking how clearly they illustrated the asymmetry at the heart of the RAF's crisis. Lord Beaverbrook, press baron, Churchill's close ally, appointed Minister of Aircraft Production on the 14th of May, 1940, had by the beginning of July already driven a 62% increase in new aircraft production. Repaired aircraft output was up by a staggering 186%. The factories were working. Metal was being shaped, riveted, tested, and delivered. By July 1940, the RAF had a reserve stockpile of fighters that was growing week by week, more aircraft in storage than Fighter Command had possessed on the day Dunkirk began. The production war had been identified and was being won, but there was no equivalent ministry for pilots. There was no Beaverbrook of human beings. You couldn't stamp out an experienced fighter pilot in 12 weeks. The aircraft could be replaced, not quickly enough at the very worst moments that lay ahead, but they could be replaced. What couldn't be replaced on any comparable industrial timescale was the accumulated knowledge that lived inside a man who'd spent 18 months flying fighters. The knowledge of how to manage his throttle at 22,000 feet, how to get his sights on a crossing target, when to brake, when to press. The RAF was entering the most demanding air campaign in its history, with an aircraft reserve that was growing and a pilot reserve that was, in some squadrons, thinning towards something that people in authority tried very hard not to name plainly. Churchill named something else entirely. On the 4th of June 1940, he stood before Parliament and delivered the speech that the whole world remembers. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." It is magnificent oratory, and it was received as such. But somewhere in those same hours, the Air Ministry was receiving paperwork that described a rather more specific and more fragile situation than the speech acknowledged. Both things were true simultaneously. That's the part that tends to get lost. By late June 1940, the outline of what was coming was clear to anyone who was reading the right documents. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe was consolidating its airfields in northern France, Belgium, and Norway. The Dornier and Heinkel formations were being positioned. The fighter groups were moving to the Pas de Calais. The geography was straightforward. From the French coast, a Messerschmitt could reach southeastern England in minutes. The Channel had been, for centuries, Britain's strategic asset, the moat, the buffer, the thing that stopped armies. Now an air force didn't need to cross it in boats. It only needed to cross it in the air, and it was already doing that every day over the convoys. The Battle of Britain hadn't started yet, officially, not according to the calendars, but in the maintenance hangars, and in the training reports, and in the columns of Form 78, it had been underway for weeks. Chapter 2. the architect of the invisible wall. The 17th of February 1935, a grass airfield in Northamptonshire, cold and unremarkable, goes by the name of Weedon. A BBC transmitter nearby is broadcasting a standard program. A small team of scientists, gathered by a man named Robert Watson Watt, have rigged up a receiver in the back of a van. What they are trying to detect is not an aircraft. They're trying to detect the radio waves that bounce off an aircraft. And what they find, over the course of that gray afternoon, is that it works. Not perfectly, not even very well by later standards. But the principle is confirmed. Radio waves reflect off metal objects in flight, and those reflections can, in theory, be measured and interpreted. Watson Watt writes to the Air Ministry within days. His report is cautious, precise, and transformative. It is also, read carefully, shot through with the knowledge of its own limitations. What Watson Watt was proposing, and what would eventually become the chain home network, was not the radar people imagine when they use the word today. It wasn't a rotating dish, sending out a tight focused beam and sweeping the sky in clean circles. Chain home was a bistatic system. Separate transmitting and receiving aerials, fixed in place, staring out to sea like enormous radio lighthouses. The transmitting towers at the first stations were 360 feet of steel, the receiver towers 240 feet of timber. The system broadcast on frequencies between 22 and 30 megahertz, what engineers call metric wavelengths, which were chosen not because they were ideal, but because they could be built, quickly, with equipment that actually existed. Watson Watt understood the trade-offs he was making. He had to deliver something that worked before it was too late, and the history of this decision is in many ways the central engineering decision of the Battle of Britain. The 22 megahertz frequency gave chain home two great gifts and one dangerous limitation. The gifts were range, detections up to 120 miles at altitude, and the ability to see aircraft while they were still forming up over France, before they reached the Channel. At that range, with average processing times, a scramble order could be issued approximately 8 minutes before a raid crossed the English coast. 8 minutes sounds small. In a fighter that climbs at 2,000 feet per minute, 8 minutes of warning time is the difference between meeting the enemy at altitude and being bounced from above while still in the climb. The limitation was equally specific. Chain home couldn't track aircraft flying below roughly 1,500 feet. Not at all. The long wavelengths that gave it range also spread its beam into a broad lobe that slid over the surface. Anything low enough to fly under that lobe was, from chain home's perspective, invisible. Watson Watt had written this down himself. The man who built the wall had documented the gap in its foundation. To me, the most fascinating aspect of the whole chain home story isn't the technology itself. It's what the British built around the technology to compensate for its imperfections. Because chain home didn't work alone. Once a raid crossed the English coastline, the radar was effectively blind. The inland tracking network then fell to the Royal Observer Corps, civilian volunteers stationed at posts across the country, equipped with instruments no more sophisticated than a calibrated height-finding bar and binoculars, connected to group headquarters by telephone. Britain's air defense grid was therefore, for its entire inland half, operated by people who reported what they saw and heard to someone on a telephone who plotted it on a table. This hybrid human-machine architecture was not a fallback position. It was the design system. And understanding that is important because it means the Dowding system was not a radar network with some human support. It was a human network that used radar as its eyes at the coast. The full Dowding system that existed by July 1940 had 4 distinct layers. Chain home stations around the coast detected forming raids and measured their approximate direction, range, and numbers. A filter room at Bentley Priory in Middlesex received all this data, cross-checked it against multiple stations, and produced a single coherent operational picture, filtering out the noise, the double counts, the ambiguous echoes. That picture went immediately to the Fighter Command Operations Room, also at Bentley Priory, where it was translated into vectors and threat assessments for the groups. From there it flowed to the group operations rooms, 11 group for southeastern England, 12 group for the Midlands, and from the groups to the individual sector stations, which held the actual squadrons and gave pilots their scramble orders, their vectors, and their altitude instructions. Average time from initial radar detection to a scramble order being issued, approximately 8 minutes. Average time for a Spitfire squadron to reach 20,000 feet from the moment of scramble, approximately 12 minutes. The geometry was always tight. The Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, the IC section, did identify the chain-home masts. Their reports from July 1940 described the towers on the English coast as almost certainly components of an early warning system. The recommendation in those reports was consistent: attack the radar stations as a primary objective, because without them, the RAF would be flying blind. On the 12th of August 1940, the day before the opening of Adlerangriff, the Germans did exactly that. A coordinated attack struck several chain-home stations, putting at least one completely off the air for several hours. It was the most tactically intelligent thing the Luftwaffe did during the entire battle. And then, on the following day, they stopped doing it. The exact reason for abandoning the radar attacks has never been cleanly established from the surviving records. What the documents suggest is that Luftwaffe intelligence had concluded the stations were too resilient to be permanently destroyed. The conclusion was wrong, and it was consequential. When I was working through the technical literature on chain-home's height-finding capability, I kept returning to a specific operational problem that rarely gets discussed. The system's height measurement above 15,000 feet was acknowledged by operators themselves to be unreliable. The cathode ray tube displays at chain-home stations could indicate range and bearing with reasonable precision, but extracting an altitude from the signal required triangulation between two fixed aerials, a process that introduced significant error at high altitude. WAAF operators trained specifically in height estimation describe, in their post-war accounts, a process that was part science and part judgment. Reading the display, applying a mental correction factor derived from experience, and reporting a figure that was a considered estimate rather than a measurement. Controllers at the group operations rooms knew this, and they learned to factor it into their decisions. The imperfection was managed, but it was never eliminated. What Robert Watson Watt had created by the summer of 1940 was something that can't be fully described by listing its technical specifications. It was a network, yes, but more precisely, it was a doctrine, a philosophy of how information should flow, how people and machines should relate to each other, how an air defense force should be commanded. The Luftwaffe had better individual radar sets in some respects. German Freya radar used higher frequencies and rotating aerials that gave better angular resolution. But Freya fed no equivalent of Bentley Priory. It had no filter room, no operations room chain, no agreed protocol for translating a radar plot into a scramble order. German radar told you something was coming. The Dowding system told you how many there were, roughly where they were going, and how much time you had. The difference, in the summer of 1940, was everything. Chapter 3. Kanalkampf. The Channel Bleeds First. The 10th of July, 1940. Off the coast of Kent, a westbound convoy is moving through haze. The sea is not dramatic. This is the English Channel in summer. Gray-green, moderate swell, the kind of weather that feels ordinary unless you know what's above it. The convoy's designation is administrative. The code word assigned to it is bread. 6 hurricanes from a fighter squadron are orbiting somewhere above the masts. Somewhere to the south, across the narrow stretch of water that separates England from occupied France, a formation of German aircraft is assembling over the Pas de Calais, approximately 30 Dornier Do-17s. Above and behind them, twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110s as close escort. Higher still, single-engine Bf-109s as top cover. 70 aircraft against 6. The RAF's policy of committing minimum forces over the channel was deliberate. Dowding was not going to bleed his squadrons dry protecting merchant ships, but it meant the men who answered the scramble call understood the arithmetic before they climbed. The period historians call the Kanalkampf, the Channel Battle, ran from the 10th of July to the 11th of August, 1940. It was not, in the popular understanding of the Battle of Britain, the real battle. It gets treated as a prologue, a preliminary, a warm-up act before the main offensive began. That framing is understandable and wrong. What happened over the Channel in those 33 days was a systematic exchange of tactical information between two air forces that had not met at scale before. Every engagement was data. Every combat report filed by a pilot landing with oil on his windscreen was an increment of operational knowledge. The problem, one that would persist throughout the whole campaign, was that the German side processed this data differently than the British and arrived at different conclusions from it, for reasons that had less to do with intelligence and more to do with institutional predisposition. Convoy Peewit, designated CW9, left Southend on the 7th of August and was attacked repeatedly the following day by a Luftwaffe force of approximately 300 aircraft, flying in 3 coordinated waves. The RAF scrambled repeatedly throughout the day, committed multiple squadrons across several sorties, and ended the day with 6 merchant vessels sunk, and its own fighter loss for the day totaled at more than 20 aircraft. This was not a British victory. By almost any measure, ships sunk, aircraft lost relative to escort forces committed, it was the reverse. The Air Ministry's public communications at the time described the day's fighting in terms that emphasized German aircraft destroyed, without dwelling on the convoy's fate. Convoy Peewit was effectively destroyed as a convoy, and the English Channel, as a viable daytime shipping route, was effectively closed to British merchant traffic. The Luftwaffe had achieved something tangible and significant. It had done so at a cost, but the cost was one it could absorb. There was a specific technical factor that shaped almost every engagement over the Channel, and it's one I think deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E's Daimler-Benz DB601 engine used direct fuel injection, a system that maintained fuel delivery under negative gravitational forces. When a pilot pushed the stick forward and nosed down into a dive, the engine simply kept running. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, fitted to both the Hurricane and the Spitfire, used a float-type carburetor. Under negative gravity, the float lifted, the fuel flow interrupted, and the engine cut out for between 3 and 5 seconds before the float resettled and power returned. 3 seconds doesn't sound long. In a high-speed engagement, 3 seconds is enough for the other aircraft to open a 300-yard gap. German pilots learned this quickly. A standard Bf 109 disengagement maneuver, push forward, nose down, accelerate away in a hard dive, would momentarily strand any British pilot trying to follow him, because his engine would cough and stammer for exactly long enough to make pursuit impossible. This wasn't a secret. RAF combat reports from July 1940 document it clearly. The fix, a simple mechanical restrictor later designed by engineer Beatrice Schilling at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, would not reach frontline squadrons until March 1941. Through the entire Battle of Britain, British fighter pilots climbed into aircraft with a known and documented aeromechanical disadvantage built into the most critical moment of a combat engagement. What the Kanalkampf gave the German side was not a defeat of the RAF. It gave something subtler and, in retrospect, more dangerous: confidence in the wrong conclusions. German pilots over the Channel were consistently seeing damaged Hurricanes limping away, trailing smoke. They were watching formation after formation of RAF fighters arrive, fight, and disengage. They were filing combat reports claiming aircraft destroyed, and somewhere behind them, in the planning offices of Luftwaffe 2 and 3, these reports were being aggregated into an assessment that said Fighter Command was already under severe pressure and losing aircraft it couldn't replace. The overcounting problem was genuine on both sides. Pilots in overlapping engagements over open water genuinely, honestly reported the same aircraft falling. The RAF's own claim statistics from the Kanalkampf phase are significantly higher than the actual German losses established by post-war cross-referencing. But the German overclaiming was systematically worse, because it fed directly into an intelligence picture that was already predisposed toward optimism. By late July 1940, a quiet decision was made that the official history of the battle doesn't advertise loudly. Daylight convoy routing through the Straits of Dover was effectively suspended. The merchant ships didn't stop sailing. They simply stopped sailing in daylight through the most exposed part of the Channel. The Luftwaffe hadn't destroyed the RAF over the Channel, but it had closed an economic artery that had functioned for centuries. About 70,000 gross registered tons of British merchant shipping were lost in the Channel and adjacent waters during the Kanalkampf. Not a catastrophic number in itself, but a signal. A demonstration that the Luftwaffe could, at acceptable cost, impose its will on a contested maritime area. On the other side of the ledger, Fighter Command lost approximately 115 fighters during the same period. Aircraft that Beaverbrook's factories could replace, but pilots who had used those weeks to accumulate irreplaceable operational experience. The Hurricane was doing most of the fighting. This is worth stating plainly, because the post-war mythology of the Battle of Britain was constructed largely around the Spitfire. Its elliptical wings, its photogenic lines, its association with the finest hours of the campaign. But during the Kanalkampf and throughout the battle as a whole, it was the Hurricane that carried the majority of the fighting weight. Historians cross-referencing operational records have consistently found that the Hurricane accounted for something in the order of 55% of all German aircraft destroyed during the battle, against the Spitfire's 42%. The Spitfire was faster, more agile at high altitude, and better suited to combat against the Bf-109. Tactically, the standard doctrine was to send Spitfires against the German fighter escorts, while Hurricanes attacked the bombers. But in terms of raw operational contribution, the aircraft that the public treated as the lesser machine was, by the numbers, the more prolific killer. The Hurricane was the unglamorous workhorse of a campaign that needed workhorses far more than it needed legends. To me, the single most telling tactical detail of the Kanalkampf isn't found in the aircraft loss statistics. It's found in a pattern in the combat reports, the repeated observation, across multiple squadrons, that German formations were not pressing home their convoy attacks when RAF fighters arrived in numbers. They were breaking off. The Luftwaffe was probing, testing, gathering data, but it wasn't committing to the kind of sustained engagement that might have told it something accurate about fighter command's real depth and resilience. This was partly tactical caution, and partly an operational plan that designated the Kanalkampf as a preliminary phase rather than the main effort. But the effect was to deny the German side the most important piece of information it needed. Not how many British fighters there were, but how quickly the British system could replace the ones it lost. That answer, had they sought it seriously over the Channel in July and early August, might have given them a very different picture going into Adlerangriff. They didn't seek it, they assumed they already knew. Chapter 4. Adlerangriff. The eagle sharpens its talons. The 1st of August, 1940. Karrenhall, the vast estate northeast of Berlin, where Hermann Göring had built himself a monument to his own grandiosity, full of art, full of marble, full of the confidence of a man who'd watched his Air Force flatten Warsaw, Rotterdam, and half of France. The Luftwaffe's air fleet commanders had assembled there for a conference. On the table was a timeline. 4 days, that's what the plan called for. To destroy fighter command south of a line from London to Gloucester. 4 weeks to eliminate the RAF entirely. After that, the sea crossing. After that, England. The specific nature of the confidence in that room is documented in the planning papers and the conference minutes that survived the war. It was total. It was also, as we can now see from the other side of the archive, built on a foundation that was structurally false. The intelligence document that underpinned Adlerangriff was produced by Major Josef Beppo Schmid, the chief of Luftwaffe intelligence. His assessment of the RAF, sometimes referred to in the secondary literature as Studie Blau, was compiled from a variety of sources: pilot debrief reports from the Kanalkampf, signals intelligence, pre-war press reports on British aviation production, and estimates from German agents operating in Britain who, the British knew and the Germans didn't know they knew, had mostly been turned or were providing controlled information. The document told Göring what Göring needed to hear. It estimated fighter command strength at between 400 and 700 aircraft, of which only a fraction was fully combat ready. It assessed British aircraft production as too slow to sustain significant losses. It described the RAF's command structure as rigid and centralized, liable to crack under sustained pressure. Almost every major conclusion was wrong, not slightly off, structurally wrong, wrong in ways that would directly determine the course of the campaign. The specific error about fighter command's command structure deserves particular attention because it shaped the entire Adlerangriff campaign plan. Schmidt's assessment treated fighter command as a monolithic organization, a single entity that would degrade uniformly as its components were attacked. The actual structure was something quite different. Fighter command was organized into groups, and the groups into sector stations, each of which could control its allocated squadrons independently. The sector station was the operational node of the system, not Bentley Priory, not the group operations rooms. If you attacked a sector station and put it temporarily out of action, you hadn't damaged fighter command. You had, at worst, degraded one node in a distributed network that could reroute information and command around the damaged point. This was a design feature, not an accident. Dowding had built redundancy into his system from the beginning, but Schmid's analysis never modeled this architecture, and the Adlerangriff plan therefore attacked targets as though destroying them would produce cascading system failure. when the actual result of most successful attacks was local, temporary degradation. Führer Directive No. 16, issued on the 16th of July, 1940, established the conditions that had to be met before Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of England, could proceed. The key phrase, in the operational sense, was unambiguous. The English Air Force must be reduced in strength and morale to the point where it offered no significant opposition to the German crossing. This was the Luftwaffe's assigned mission. Everything that followed, every sortie, every bomb, every pilot lost or taken prisoner, was a function of that directive. The document was clear that air superiority over the Channel and southern England was the prerequisite for invasion, not a desirable condition. If the RAF existed in any meaningful strength, the sea crossing couldn't happen. The pressure on Göring was therefore absolute. He had to destroy Fighter Command, on a specific timeline, in a specific geographical area, without the option of adjusting the goalposts. The operational planning inside Luftwaffe 2 and Luftwaffe 3, the two air fleets that would bear the primary burden of Adlerangriff, reveals a significant internal disagreement that the post-war narrative tends to smooth over. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding Luftwaffe 2 from Brussels, favored sustained attacks on airfields and radar stations, with the explicit objective of forcing Fighter Command into combat over its own infrastructure, wearing it down through attrition, while simultaneously degrading the ground system it depended on. Field Marshal Hugo Sperle, commanding Luftwaffe 3 from Paris, argued for attacking aircraft factories directly, the Supermarine plant at Southampton, the Hawker Works at Kingston, to cut production, rather than chase squadrons that could be dispersed and reinforced. Göring's resolution of this disagreement was to do both simultaneously, plus attack ports, shipping, and radar stations. The dispersal of effort across multiple target categories was, from a resource management standpoint, the decision that guaranteed the campaign would be less efficient than either of the subordinate plans had proposed. The Messerschmitt Bf 109E was, in the summer of 1940, among the finest fighter aircraft in the world. Its Daimler-Benz DB601 engine produced approximately 1,175 horsepower in early model form. It had a rate of climb, a ceiling, and a top speed that made it a genuine match for the Spitfire in most performance categories, and superior to the Hurricane in several. But it had a range problem that was not cosmetic. Operating from airfields in the Pas de Calais, the Bf 109E had a combat radius, the distance from base within which it could fight and return, of approximately 300 kilometers. London sits roughly 160 kilometers from the Calais coast, so the arithmetic worked, barely. A Bf 109 could reach London. What it couldn't do was loiter over London for more than 7 to 10 minutes before the fuel state required a return. Every German fighter pilot flying escort over England in 1940 was carrying a fuel gauge that was, in operational terms, a countdown. They couldn't pursue. They couldn't orbit waiting for stragglers. They had to fly straight, fight if they had to, and turn for France on schedule. When I was working through the German planning documents for this chapter, the figure that I kept returning to was the Luftwaffe's total frontline strength committed to Adlerangriff. Across Luftwaffe 2, 3, and 5, the combined available force amounted to approximately 2,550 aircraft of all types. Of those, roughly 929 were single-engine Bf 109 fighters. Against them, Fighter Command could field approximately 640 serviceable Hurricanes and Spitfires. The raw numerical balance was heavily in the Luftwaffe's favor, more than 3 to 1 in total aircraft, but aggregate numbers conceal the operational realities. A Bf 109 and a Hurricane are both fighter aircraft, but one of them has to fly 200 miles to reach the battle area, fight for 10 minutes, and fly 200 miles home, while the other can fight until it needs fuel, land on a friendly airfield, refuel, and be back in the air within the hour. Time and distance were strategic assets that didn't appear in the order of battle, and the German planning, for all its thoroughness, never adequately accounted for them. The most consequential error that Schmid's intelligence assessment made, the one that sits at the root of almost everything that followed, was its misreading of British aircraft production capacity. Schmid estimated that the RAF could not sustain production sufficient to replace significant losses. The actual figure, by July 1940, was roughly 470 new fighters per month and rising, against German fighter production of approximately 300. The production war was already going in the wrong direction for Germany before Adlerangriff had fired a single shot. Had Schmidt's section produced an accurate production estimate, the 4-day timeline for destroying Fighter Command would have been immediately exposed as a fantasy. The German High Command would have faced a simple arithmetic problem. In a prolonged campaign of attrition, whose factories win? The answer was Britain's, and it was knowable in the summer of 1940. It just wasn't what anyone at Hall wanted to know. Chapter 5. Adler Tag. Eagle Day's Paper Wings. 0450 hours, the 13th of August, 1940. Somewhere on an airfield in the Pas de Calais, the engines of 74 Dornier Do-17 bombers are turning over. The Kampfgeschwader 2 crews have had their briefings. They know their targets. They know their routing. They know that their fighter escort, Messerschmitt Bf-110s from Superiority 26, will meet them over the channel at a specific rendezvous point at a specific time. What the crews of those 74 aircraft don't know, as they check their instruments and cinch their harnesses, is that at some point in the previous 2 hours, a recall order was transmitted by Luftwaffe 2 headquarters. The weather over England had deteriorated. The opening of Adlertag, Eagle Day, the first day of the decisive offensive, was being postponed until the afternoon. The recall signal was sent. It reached some units. The Zerstörergeschwader received it and stood down. The Dorniers of Kampfgeschwader 2, already at their aircraft, engines already running, did not receive it in time, or the message was delayed, or it was garbled. The operations log records the departure. It doesn't record a reason for failing to comply. 74 bombers climbed into the morning sky and flew toward England without their escort. This is how Eagle Day began. The 13th of August, 1940, had been designed to be the moment when the Luftwaffe's full weight fell on Fighter Command and cracked it open. Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack, had been weeks in the planning, detailed in directives, announced in Göring's characteristically theatrical language as the blow that would end the RAF's ability to resist. The operational target was Fighter Command's infrastructure: sector stations, radar towers, aircraft factories, fuel and ammunition stores. The plan was real, the intent was serious, and the numerical resources behind it were formidable. What the plan couldn't account for was the friction that military planners theorize about and operational commanders actually encounter: the degradation of intention as it passes through layers of human organization under conditions of weather, communication failure, and command at distance. On the very first morning of the decisive offensive, a failed signal put unescorted bombers over England because 2 parts of the same force were operating on different information. The target that Kampfgeschwader 2's unescorted Dorniers actually struck that morning was Eastchurch Airfield on the Isle of Sheppey in the Thames estuary. Eastchurch was an airfield. Its runways were cratered, its buildings damaged. In the report filed subsequently, it appears as a successful attack on an RAF installation. Here is what Luftwaffe intelligence hadn't correctly established. Eastchurch was a coastal command station. It had no role in Fighter Command's air defense network. The squadrons based there didn't scramble to intercept German formations over southern England. The operations room at Eastchurch had no connection to the sector station communications chain that controlled the fighter defense. Bombing Eastchurch had approximately the same effect on Fighter Command's capacity to fight as bombing an administrative building in the Midlands, which is to say, none. And this was not a one-time targeting error. German intelligence misidentified Coastal Command and Fleet Air Arm airfields as Fighter Command stations repeatedly and consistently throughout the battle. Eastchurch alone was attacked at least 5 times. Every bomb that fell there was a bomb that didn't fall on Biggin Hill or Hornchurch or Kenley. The Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber, the Stuka, flew extensively on the 13th of August and on the days that followed. It had been the icon of German air power through Poland and France and the Low Countries, the screaming, gull-winged precision instrument of Blitzkrieg, the thing that made roads full of refugees dissolve in panic. Over England, it encountered something it hadn't encountered in previous campaigns: coherent, radar-cued fighter opposition, arriving with altitude advantage and time to position. The Stuka's maximum level speed was approximately 238 miles per hour. A Spitfire's maximum speed was approximately 360 miles per hour. In a straight chase, the numbers are simply what they are. The Stuka's bomb delivery required a specific technique, a near-vertical dive held for several seconds along a predictable trajectory, followed by a pull-out profile that every RAF pilot who had seen one could anticipate. When Hurricanes and Spitfires were present in numbers and in position, the Stuka was not a weapon, it was a target. On the 18th of August, the day the documentation describes as the hardest single day of fighting during the whole campaign, approximately 109 Stuka dive bombers, operating in formation against targets at Thorney Island and Ford on the Sussex coast, were intercepted by Hurricanes from 43 Squadron and Spitfires from 601st Squadron. The result was, in the cold language of the after-action summary, a catastrophe for the attacking force. Approximately 22 Stukas were shot down, and a further 14 were seriously damaged, a loss rate of approximately 33% of the attacking force, in a single engagement lasting under an hour. The type was effectively withdrawn from daylight operations over England within days. The aircraft that had defined German air power in the public imagination was, in the specific context of radar-cued British fighter opposition, unsurvivable. This is the kind of information that, if properly absorbed by the German High Command, should have triggered a fundamental reconsideration of what Adlerangriff was actually capable of achieving. It wasn't absorbed, at least not quickly enough. The aircraft loss numbers for Adlertag itself, the 13th of August, tell their own story once you strip away the claims and cross-reference them against the confirmed records. The Luftwaffe flew approximately 1,485 sorties that day, its largest single-day effort to that point. Fighter Command flew 727 sorties in response and lost approximately 15 aircraft in combat. German losses amounted to approximately 45 aircraft confirmed destroyed across all types. The ratio, 3 German aircraft lost for each RAF aircraft, was not what Adlerangriff required. To destroy Fighter Command in 4 days, the Luftwaffe needed to be accumulating losses at a rate that outpaced replacement. The replacement rate for British fighters in mid-August was, thanks to Beaverbrook's program, approximately 15 to 20 aircraft per day. At the loss rate the 13th of August demonstrated, Fighter Command wasn't being depleted. It was sustaining. Goering received the reports of the day's fighting with what the surviving conference minutes describe as satisfaction. The Luftwaffe had flown more than 1,000 sorties. Dozens of RAF aircraft had been claimed as destroyed. Eastchurch had been bombed. The offensive was, by his reading, proceeding as planned. I find this moment almost more interesting than any of the combat itself, because what we can see, looking at both sides of the archive simultaneously, is an absolute failure of signal at the command level. The German aircrew flying those sorties were performing with genuine courage and professional skill. The German aircraft were, in most respects, competitive with or superior to their opponents in individual performance. The plan was coherent and resourced, and yet the information passing upward through the German command chain was being systematically distorted, not through dishonesty, but through the compounding effects of combat claiming, intelligence predisposition, and the natural human tendency to fit data to existing expectations. Goering was receiving a version of the 13th of August that would have required a very different day to have produced, and on the basis of that version, he ordered the campaign to continue. The afternoon raids on the 13th of August, with fighter escort present and better weather cooperating, achieved more than the chaotic morning. Specific airfield targets were struck, and Fighter Command's defending squadrons were engaged in significant combat across Kent and Hampshire. But even the afternoon's fighting didn't produce the exchange rate Adlerangriff required. Luftwaffe crew claims for the entire day totaled approximately 30 British fighters destroyed. The actual RAF confirmed loss was 15. The overcounting was structural, not deliberate, built into the nature of fast, multi-participant over-water combat, where multiple pilots genuinely see the same aircraft going down. But it meant that the operational planners at Luftwaffe 2 were doing their post-battle accounting with numbers that described a war that was, systematically and consistently, going slightly better for Germany than the one that was actually being fought. That small, persistent error compounded over days and then over weeks. By the time its cumulative effect became undeniable, the fighting season was almost over. Chapter 6. The Hardest Day, August 18th, 1940. The morning of the 18th of August, 1940, arrives over southern England with reasonable visibility and light cloud. What the meteorological records for the day describe as fair conditions, with shower risk in the afternoon. At Uxbridge, in the underground operations room of 11 Group, the day shift is settling in. The plotting table is clean, the colored position counters are at rest. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park arrives early, as he usually does, and reviews the overnight incident reports before the day's operations begin. There is nothing in the early morning hours to indicate that this particular day will produce more aircraft destroyed, on both sides combined, than any other day in the entire 4 months of the battle. The day doesn't announce itself, it just becomes. What happened on the 18th of August 1940 is sometimes called the hardest day in the literature, and the name is accurate in the most straightforward, measurable sense. The combined aircraft losses on both sides were the highest of the campaign, but the number, by itself, doesn't convey what was actually at stake. The Luftwaffe on this day was committed to the most sustained and coordinated assault on Fighter Command's sector station infrastructure that Adlerangriff had yet mounted. The targets were not peripheral, they were the actual working nodes of the Dowding system. Kenley, Biggin Hill, Croydon, Manston, the forward operating fields, the radar-linked operations rooms that converted electronic signals and human observation into scramble orders. If those nodes could be put out of action simultaneously and kept out of action long enough, the radar picture would still exist, but the command layer that acted on it would be temporarily paralyzed. The plan was sound. The execution was where things became complicated. The attack on Kenley Sector Station was the most operationally significant single event of the day, and it succeeded in ways the standard account doesn't always convey fully. 9 Dornier Do-17s from Kampfgeschwader 76 flew the attack at rooftop height, between 50 and 100 feet above the Surrey countryside, following the contours of the North Downs in a profile specifically designed to slip beneath Chain Home's low-altitude blind spot. They were detected visually by an observer corps post, which provided approximately 4 minutes of warning. That was not enough time for the Kenley fighter squadrons to scramble and climb. The Dorniers crossed the airfield boundary and released their bombs in the kind of low-level spread that maximizes damage to surface infrastructure. 4 hangars were destroyed. The water mains were cut. The power supply was disrupted. The runways were cratered. The station's main operations room, a surface building built for convenience rather than survivability, was rendered unusable. By any immediate post-strike assessment, Kenley was out of action. Except that it wasn't out of action. Not completely. Not permanently, because tucked away in a requisition shop on a quiet road in the nearby town of Caterham was a reserve operations room, pre-planned, pre-equipped, pre-staffed, and rehearsed months before the battle began. Within approximately 2 hours of the main building being destroyed, Kenley Sector was processing plots and issuing scramble orders again, at reduced capacity but with functional communications, from an address that no Luftwaffe intelligence document listed as a military target. This was Dowding's architecture at work in exactly the situation it had been designed for. The attack on Kenley had consumed bombs, aircraft, and aircrew. Some of the attacking Dorniers were destroyed by the Kenley anti-aircraft defenses even as they released their weapons. And at the end of it all, the sector was still fighting. The gap in the defensive grid lasted approximately 2 hours. 2 hours. In the context of a campaign that was supposed to destroy Fighter Command in 4 days, 2 hours of local degradation is the measure of a plan that had fundamentally misjudged its target. Biggin Hill was also struck on the 18th of August. The operations room there was damaged, though not destroyed that day. That particular distinction came on the 30th of August, in an attack that would kill nearly 40 people and reduce the station to improvised operation from a caravan. On the 18th, Biggin Hill's runways were cratered, and its capacity was reduced. And Park, managing the battle from Uxbridge, faced the specific problem that defines high-tempo command, making resource decisions in conditions of acute uncertainty. He didn't know whether Biggin Hill was temporarily suppressed or critically damaged. He didn't know whether the next wave of German aircraft was aimed at more sector stations or at something else entirely. Every decision about committing the few remaining reserve squadrons was made in the knowledge that being wrong in either direction, committing too early and leaving something else undefended, or holding too long and leaving a sector station unprotected, had consequences that couldn't be undone. The surviving Uxbridge operations log entries for the mid-afternoon of the 18th carry that tension in every terse line. I spent time specifically with the documentation around the afternoon interceptions on the 18th of August, because I think the scale of what happened to the Stuka formations tends to be underreported in the general accounts. The German force attacking Thorney Island and Ford included approximately 109 dive bombers. Against them, the available RAF squadrons included Hurricanes and Spitfires that had been scrambled with adequate warning and had achieved altitude advantage before the German formations reached their targets. The engagement was not a dogfight in the conventional sense. It was a systematic destruction of a slow, predictable aircraft type by faster fighters with positional advantage. The Stuka's designed operating environment was one in which either air superiority had already been established or the enemy fighters had been neutralized by escort. Neither condition obtained over southern England on the 18th of August. The 22 Stukas confirmed shot down, with 14 more seriously damaged, represented roughly a third of the attacking force. The type was withdrawn from the daylight offensive within days, and while this is sometimes presented as a footnote, the Stuka's removal, it was actually the first clear signal that the Luftwaffe's operational assumptions about what kinds of aircraft could survive over England were wrong, and that the Adlerangriff plan would have to be substantially restructured, even if everything else was going as intended. The total confirmed German aircraft losses on the 18th of August came to approximately 71 destroyed. Fighter Command lost approximately 27 aircraft, 71 against 27. The exchange ratio, by any measure, was not what Adlerangriff required. The Luftwaffe needed to be destroying Fighter Command faster than it could replace its losses. And on the 18th of August, in the costliest fighting of the entire campaign, it was falling well short of that threshold. What it had done instead was demonstrate, at severe cost to itself, that sector station attacks could achieve temporary local degradation, but not systemic breakdown. That dive bombers without overhead fighter superiority were not viable, and that Fighter Command's operations rooms were harder to permanently destroy than the planning had assumed. These were important findings. They were also findings that, properly absorbed, pointed toward conclusions the German High Command was not ready to reach. By the evening of the 18th, Göring had drawn exactly the wrong lessons from the day's fighting. Faced with the Stuka catastrophe, he issued an order directing that dive bomber units would henceforth operate only with close fighter escort. He simultaneously ordered that Bf-109 escort fighters must maintain close formation with their bomber charges, a directive that stripped the German fighters of the initiative and altitude flexibility they needed to be tactically effective. Fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader units were, by this point, already deeply frustrated by escort duty, by having to fly tied to slow bombers at altitudes and speeds that put them at disadvantage against British fighters, who could choose when and where to engage. Göring's new order made that frustration structural policy. The aircraft that was Germany's best individual weapon in the entire campaign, the Bf-109, with its speed, its ceiling, its range margin over the battle area, was now formally reduced to a flying shield for aircraft that couldn't protect themselves. It would be hard to design a more efficient way of converting numerical strength into tactical weakness. Chapter 7. The Mathematics of Attrition. The final day of August, 1940. Somewhere inside the Air Ministry, a clerk opens a ledger and enters two numbers in adjacent columns. Pilots lost in the week just ended, 115. Replacement pilots dispatched from operational training units to frontline squadrons in the same 7 days, 65. The difference is 50 pilots. Written as a figure in a weekly return, it looks like an administrative shortfall, a matter to be noted, flagged to the relevant directorate, managed. Except that by the end of August 1940, Fighter Command had been running that deficit for weeks. Each week the column subtracted more than it added. Each week the experience inside the squadrons thinned a little further. Each week the men who knew how to fight the Luftwaffe, not merely how to fly toward it, but how to engage it and come back, were fewer in number, and the men who replaced them were younger, less prepared, and statistically less likely to survive their first fortnight of operations. The Battle of Britain is usually told as a production story. Beaverbrook arrives, chaos becomes order, the factories surge, the aircraft flow. And this is true. The production numbers are genuinely extraordinary. By the beginning of July, new fighter output had risen by 62% from its pre-Beaverbrook levels. Repaired aircraft returning to service were up by 186%. The Castle Bromwich factory near Birmingham, which had produced exactly 10 Spitfires in the entire first quarter of 1940, was by September building them faster than any single facility in the country. The medal story is real, and it mattered. But there is another story running alongside it, a story that doesn't appear in the production columns, and that story is about the people who had to fly the medal, and about the irreversible way in which the summer of 1940 consumed them. When I was working through the pilot availability returns for August and September, the production figures made me feel something close to relief. The manpower figures made me feel something different entirely. The operational training unit course, before the war began, ran for approximately 6 months. A pilot who completed it had flown enough hours to have developed real instinct on his aircraft, to have practiced gun harmonization, deflection shooting at crossing targets, high-altitude oxygen management, and the specific formation break procedures that kept a pilot from being someone else's easy kill. By the 19th of August, 1940, the Air Ministry had reduced the OTU course to 2 weeks. 2 weeks of flying, 2 weeks of instruction, and then a posting to a frontline squadron in 11 Group, where the Luftwaffe was crossing the coast in strength every day. The pilots who graduated from this compressed program could fly a Hurricane. They could take off from a grass strip, manage the engine, land without bending it. What they couldn't do, reliably, was fight. The specific knowledge that kept a pilot alive in combat. When to follow a diving Bf-109 and when to let it go. How to read the geometry of an incoming attack from your 6 o'clock. How to manage a damaged engine back to an airfield instead of bailing into the sea. Took 30 to 50 hours of operational flying to develop. Most of the replacement pilots arriving through August had perhaps 15 hours on type and 0 operational hours. They were not ready, and everyone knew it, and there was no alternative. The week of the 17th of August was the single worst week for pilot casualties in the entire campaign. 68 pilots were lost, killed, seriously wounded, or captured in 7 days. Fighter Command had approximately 1,000 frontline fighter pilots at any given time. 68 losses in a week represents nearly 7% of that force. In 7 days, drawn disproportionately from the experienced squadrons in 11 Group that were doing the heaviest fighting. The week of the 7th of September was nearly as bad. 58 pilots lost. Cross-reference those weekly figures against the OTU output of 65 per week during the same period, and the arithmetic is unambiguous. The RAF was not replacing what it was losing, not in numbers, and certainly not in quality. An experienced pilot who had been flying since July represented a quantum of operational knowledge that 2 or 3 fresh OTU graduates could not collectively replicate, because the knowledge he carried wasn't transmissible in a 2-week course. It was carried in hands and eyes and nerves, and when it was gone, it was gone. The nationality composition of Fighter Command in the summer of 1940 is one of the things the popular narrative handles with a certain selective emphasis. Churchill's phrase, "the few," was accurate in its mathematics, but tended, in its cultural reception, to imply a specifically British few. Of the 2,936 aircrew who flew at least one operational sortie during the official battle period, 595 were not British, 145 were Polish, 127 were from New Zealand, 112 were Canadian, 88 were Czech, 32 were Australian, 25 were South African. The rest came from Belgium, France, Ireland, the United States, Jamaica, and elsewhere. What many of these men carried that their British counterparts often lacked was not courage. Courage was never in short supply on either side of the channel, but operational knowledge. The Polish pilots had fought over Poland in September 1939. Several had fought again over France in May and June of 1940. By the time they reached England, they had been in combat against the same aircraft, the same tactics, and the same enemy formations for 9 months. They knew what the Luftwaffe did. They knew it in the way you can only know something by having survived it. The Air Ministry's internal correspondence about the Polish squadrons in July 1940 has been available to researchers for decades, and it makes uncomfortable reading. Some of the stated concerns were operationally legitimate. English language radio discipline in a fast-moving engagement was a genuine requirement, and communication failure in an intercept scenario could be lethal for both sides. But the documentation also contains passages that reflect an institutional skepticism about foreign pilots that went beyond procedure. a caution that delayed the deployment of experienced combat veterans, while the squadrons of 11 Group were consuming their most experienced men at a rate no replacement program could match. 303 Polish Squadron was officially activated on the 2nd of August, 1940, 23 days into the battle. Its pilots had been in Britain since June. It flew its first operational sortie at the end of August. In 42 days of combat, it destroyed 126 German aircraft. That made it the highest-scoring squadron of the entire Battle of Britain. The weeks it sat at readiness in July, waiting for clearance, were not weeks the battle could afford. To me, the most revealing document in the entire pilot attrition record is not a loss return or a medical report. It's a paragraph from a communication Dowding sent to the Air Ministry on the 2nd of September 1940. He had done the arithmetic himself. He looked at the weekly casualty figures and the weekly OTU output, and the trend line between them, and he wrote, in the measured language of a professional who was not prone to exaggeration, that if losses continued at their current rate, he would be unable to guarantee the effective fighter defense of the country. Not fighter command is collapsing. Not we are losing. He said, I cannot guarantee effective defense. That's a precision statement from a man who had built the system he was describing, who understood every component of it, and who had now calculated the point at which the human component would be too thin to sustain the whole. The Air Ministry received it and acknowledged it. There was nothing it could do. The production of men at the speed the battle required them was beyond any ministry's authority to command. What changed the equation was not something that happened in London. It happened at Harrenhal, and it happened because of a different kind of error. The navigation failure over London on the night of August 24th, and the chain of political consequences that followed it, and the resulting order that redirected the Luftwaffe from Fighter Command sector stations to the City of London on the 7th of September. From that day, the systematic infrastructure attacks on Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Kenley, and the other stations of 11 Group's network eased. The runways that had been cratered and patched under fire had time to be properly repaired. The operations rooms being run from caravans and improvised telephone exchanges could be rebuilt. The pilot attrition rate remained serious. It didn't disappear, but the specific combination of pilot losses and concurrent ground infrastructure destruction that had been compressing 11 Group's operational margin towards something unsustainable suddenly stopped compressing. The factories kept working, the OTU output kept flowing, and the experience deficit, terrible as it was, at least stopped accelerating. By the time the official battle ended on the 31st of October, 1940, 544 RAF aircrew had been killed. 422 more were wounded. The Luftwaffe had lost 2,585 aircrew killed and 925 taken prisoner, men who were captured on British soil or pulled from the Channel because there was no way home for a German pilot who survived being shot down over England. The RAF pilot who bailed out over his own territory could, if not badly injured, be back in the air within days. His German counterpart entered a prison camp for the duration. That asymmetry, one Air Force fighting above its own soil, the other fighting at the end of a range-limited fuel supply above hostile territory, was not a minor tactical advantage. It was a structural feature of the campaign that the Luftwaffe's planners never found a way to offset. The ledger columns closed in November 1940. The entries stopped accumulating. The weekly pilot deficit ceased to widen. But the numbers that were already written in those columns don't disappear when the accounting ends. 544 names. Each one a person who had learned to fly, who had climbed into a cockpit over the green fields of southern England during the most dangerous summer in the island's modern history, who had done what the system needed done with whatever experience they had, and who did not come back from it. What they preserved, what the columns in their aggregate describe, was not simply the survival of a military organization. It was the survival of the possibility that the war could, from this particular island, be fought at all. Chapter 8. The Women in the Operations Room. 10:30 in the morning of the 15th of September, 1940. 76 steps below an ornamental garden in Uxbridge, Middlesex, a room is running at full operational load. The plotting table in its center covers the floor with a map of southeastern England and the approaches from France. Every grid square named, every convoy route marked, every airfield represented by a small symbol. Across this table, women in blue WAAF uniforms move colored counters with long-handled rakes, keeping the tactical picture current in real time, as telephone reports flow in from filter room at Bentley Priory, from sector stations across 11 Group's territory, from observer corps posts scattered across Kent and Sussex and Surrey. Above them, on a balcony that overlooks the table from two sides, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park stands with his staff, reading the map, directing the battle. The room is 60 feet underground. The building above it looks like nothing in particular. Inside it, in this hour, the defense of London is being managed minute by minute, counter by counter, by people who will receive no individual citation and whose names appear nowhere in the battle's popular mythology. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force had been involved in operations room work since the earliest days of the Dowding system's practical operation. By the summer of 1940, approximately 200 WAAF personnel rotated through Uxbridge on a 3-shift system, with shifts running 8 hours in theory and considerably longer in practice during the battle's worst periods. Their roles were specific and demanding. Plotters received telephone reports from the filter room and translated them into counter movements on the table, maintaining track continuity and ensuring that every formation, friendly or enemy, was represented accurately at its current or projected position. Other WAAFs operated the status board indicators mounted on the walls of the room, keeping the display of squadron states current, available, at readiness, airborne, in combat, returning to base, landed, so that Park on the balcony could read the state of every squadron in his group with a glance at the wall rather than a telephone call. Still others worked the communications network itself, maintaining the voice links between Uxbridge and the sector stations, between Uxbridge and Bentley Priory, between the operations room and the outside world. At peak engagement, the room was simultaneously tracking approximately 22 friendly formations and 17 separate enemy plots, 39 discrete track lines being maintained in real time, fed by reports from at least 12 different input sources. The system that made all this manageable, or nearly manageable, was a color-coded temporal discipline built into the plotting blocks. Each counter on the table was a specific color: yellow for the period 5 minutes ago, red for the current 5-minute interval, blue for the next anticipated period. This 3-color rotation allowed Park and his controllers to determine the age of any piece of information on the table at a glance. A yellow counter meant that plot was 5 to 10 minutes old, possibly stale, requiring mental correction for the formation's probable movement in the intervening time. A red counter was current. A blue counter was a projection. The system required plotters to rotate the color of their blocks continuously as each 5-minute interval passed, maintaining the discipline even under heavy workload. When that discipline was maintained, the table was a reliable real-time tactical picture. When exhaustion or stress caused it to break down, and it did, during the most intense engagements, the picture degraded. Controllers on the balcony learned to read the table, not just for what it showed, but for how cleanly it was being maintained, because the cleanliness of the color rotation told them something about the state of the people working below them. The oral history record for WAAF plotters and operations room staff is substantial. The Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive holds multiple interviews with women who served in this role, and what those interviews contain is something the official Air Ministry accounts of the period don't quite accommodate. The official documents describe WAAF contributions in the language of institutional praise: calm, efficient, invaluable, composed under pressure. The oral testimony describes something more complicated. Edith Heap, who served as an operations room plotter at RAF Debden during the battle, recalled in her IWM interview that the work required a particular kind of discipline, not the suppression of emotion, exactly, but its continuous redirection. You were moving a counter that represented an enemy formation heading toward a counter that represented your squadron. The counters merged. You waited for the phone call that would tell you what had happened when they merged. The phone call came, or it didn't. You moved the counters. You kept the color rotation. There was no space in the mechanism of the work itself for anything else. The psychological cost of sustained operations room work is something the official record approached carefully and largely avoided stating plainly. The Air Ministry pamphlet produced in 1941 to document the WAAF's role in the battle is accurate in its facts and careful in its emotional register. It describes women who performed flawlessly under difficult conditions, which is true, without examining what that performance extracted from them, which would have been harder to write and less useful for recruitment purposes. The oral histories are less managed. Multiple accounts describe sleep disruption, a persistent physical tension that didn't resolve between shifts, and specific memories that remained vivid and uncomfortable decades later. Not dramatic memories of explosions or dramatic losses, but the quiet ones. The morning a counter you had been tracking for 20 minutes simply stopped being updated because the aircraft it represented had come down somewhere over Kent, and no further report came in. And you set the counter aside and updated the table, and the morning continued. The specific architecture of the Uxbridge operations room was the product of deliberate engineering. The room sat 60 feet below ground, deep enough to withstand near-miss bomb damage, though not a direct hit, reached by 76 steps from the surface building that concealed it. The operations room itself occupied 2 connected levels, the plotting floor below, the command balcony above, with the wall boards between them displaying the squadron status indicators in their rows of electrical lights. The plotting table was connected by telephone to filter room at Bentley Priory, which fed it a consolidated, filtered version of the radar and observer corps picture. Below the table's surface, electrical cables carried the telephone network that allowed plotters to receive reports at their designated positions without moving from the table. The whole system was designed on the premise that information had to flow in one direction only, from sensor to filter to operations room to sector station to aircraft, and that any break or delay in that chain would cost time that, given the Bf-109's range margin over England, Fighter Command couldn't spare. When Churchill arrived at Uxbridge at approximately 10:30 on the morning of the 15th of September, he sat in the visitors' gallery on the balcony and watched. He'd visited before. It was, by this point, a fairly regular thing. But September 15th was a different kind of day. The raids were larger than anything since the beginning of the campaign. The table was covered. The squadron states on the wall board ran rapidly through readiness, airborne, engaged. By the afternoon, every light in every column was lit. Park said the words that Churchill would later record as among the most affecting he heard during the entire war. No reserves, every squadron committed or returning, nothing held back. What Churchill's memoir doesn't describe, because he was watching from the balcony and his account naturally follows his own line of sight, is what was happening on the floor below Park's railing. The plotters were still working. The telephone reports were still coming in. The color rotation was still being maintained. The machine that Dowding had designed and that WAAF personnel kept running was functioning at maximum load on the most demanding day it would face, and it didn't break. The counter-coloring system degraded first under fatigue. This was documented, not in official reports, which tended to describe the system's performance in terms of its design rather than its execution, but in the testimony of the people who worked it. By late August, with shifts extended beyond their designed length and with no break in operational intensity, experienced plotters described a specific kind of error creeping in. The color rotation fell behind by 5 minutes, then 10, then slightly more. The table that a controller read as showing the current tactical picture was sometimes showing a picture that was 10 to 15 minutes old in parts of its coverage, stale enough to matter in an engagement where a formation moving at 200 miles per hour covered nearly 50 miles in 15 minutes. The system never failed completely. The redundancy built into it, and the experience of the controllers who knew how to mentally correct for aging plots, kept it functional. But the margin between functional and optimal had been compressed by weeks of sustained operation, and the compression was carried by the people on the floor, in ways that didn't show up in any operational metric. King George VI visited Uxbridge at some point during the battle. The records confirm the visit without providing the exact date. What the surviving account of the visit notes is that the king spent time specifically speaking with the WAAF plotters on the floor, rather than limiting his time to the command balcony. No transcript of those conversations survives. What does survive is the operational record of those same women through September and October, the continued maintenance of a system under conditions that the people running it understood better than anyone else, including the historians who would later describe what they'd done. The operations room at Uxbridge still exists. The plotting table is still there, with its map of southeastern England, its grid squares, its colored counters resting on the positions they occupied on September 15, 1940. You can stand on the balcony and see what Park saw. What you can't reconstruct, standing there, is what it felt like to be on the floor, to hold the rake, to receive the report, to move the counter, to keep the color discipline, and to wait for the phone call. Chapter 9. The Steel and the Merlin. Machines at the limit. Sometime after midnight, late August 1940, a grass airfield in Kent. The dispersal area is dark. Working lights are off because there's an air raid warning in force, and lit targets invite attention. And a ground crew of 4 men is working on a Hurricane by the beam of a single shielded torch, the kind of light that lets you see what you're doing without being visible from more than a few yards away. The aircraft's engine access panels are open. The Merlin 3 inside has run hard in the last 3 days. 3 or 4 combat sorties per day, at least one of them with the throttle pushed past the gate to emergency power, the boost climbing to plus 12 pounds per square inch, the engine producing 1,310 horsepower at an RPM it was not designed to sustain for extended periods. The fitter has his hand inside the cowling. He's found what he expected to find. The engine needs to come out, a replacement needs to go in, and the aircraft needs to be serviceable before the first scramble of the following morning, which is in approximately 4 hours. The Rolls-Royce Merlin 3 was the power plant that fitted the Hurricane Mark I and the early Spitfire Mark I throughout the Battle of Britain. As a piece of engineering, it was remarkable for the period. A 27-liter V12 liquid-cooled engine producing, in its standard early configuration, approximately 880 horsepower at 12,250 feet under normal combat boost settings. The switch to 100-octane aviation fuel, completed for frontline squadrons by the spring of 1940, changed the performance envelope in a way that mattered enormously in combat. At the higher fuel grade, boost pressure could be increased from plus 6 pounds per square inch to plus 12, raising peak output to 1,310 horsepower at takeoff and approximately 1,180 horsepower at 9,000 feet. That increase translated, in a Spitfire, to a top speed advantage of 25 to 30 miles per hour over its 87-octane baseline performance at low altitude, enough to change the tactical geometry of an engagement against a Bf-109 in a shallow dive. But the Merlin at plus 12 boost was a different instrument from the Merlin at plus 6. The time between overhaul at emergency power was approximately 25 hours, compared to the standard 240 hours at normal settings. An engine that had been pushed hard through 3 or 4 combat sorties over 3 days of intensive operations might be approaching or exceeding that limit. The fitters knew this. They managed it daily, on every aircraft, with the specific knowledge that being conservative meant an aircraft on the ground tomorrow, and being too liberal might mean an engine failure over the channel. The Spitfire's elliptical wing is one of the most distinctive shapes in aviation history, and it wasn't designed for aesthetic reasons. Reginald Mitchell's team chose the elliptical plan form for its aerodynamic properties, specifically the way it distributed lift across the wing's span, reducing induced drag and allowing the aircraft to turn tightly without losing energy at the rate a more conventional wing would require. The wing was thin. That was necessary for speed. A thick wing at the Spitfire's operating speeds generated too much compressibility drag. But the thin wing had a structural consequence. The Spitfire had a limiting speed beyond which the ailerons became uncomfortably heavy, and the aircraft's ability to roll was significantly degraded. Push the nose down into a hard diving pursuit at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour indicated airspeed, and the control forces required to pull out of that dive became large enough that some pilots, having followed a Bf-109 into a high-speed descent, found that recovering to level flight was a significant physical effort, and that in at least 2 documented cases during the summer of 1940, the aircraft was committed below a safe recovery altitude before the pilot could manage the pullout. The Bf-109 had similar dive limitations from different structural causes. Both aircraft were being flown at or close to their operational limits every day, and the ground crews who prepared them were always working with the knowledge that the machines they signed off as serviceable were going to be flown by exhausted pilots at those limits, under fire. The 8 Browning .303 caliber machine guns, fitted to both the Hurricane and the Spitfire, represent a specific and documented tactical debate. Each gun fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, giving a combined theoretical fire rate of 9,600 rounds per minute when all 8 were running together. Each gun carried 300 rounds, 2,400 total, giving approximately 14 to 16 seconds of continuous fire before exhaustion. Experienced pilots fired in bursts of 1 to 2 seconds, because sustained fire drained the ammunition rapidly, and because the probability of a kill in any single burst, at combat ranges, was much lower than popular accounts suggest. The harmonization point, the range at which the 8 gun streams converged on a single aim point, was set, by Air Ministry directive, at 400 yards. This was a pre-war decision, based on range calculations conducted against targets at known speeds and distances, in conditions that bore only a passing resemblance to actual combat engagements. Experienced pilots filed reports throughout the summer of 1940, arguing that the real engagement was happening at 250 yards or closer, and that at 400 yards, the 8-gun pattern was too spread to guarantee kills, even with accurate aim. Some armament officers, working with their pilots, quietly reharmonized the guns at shorter range. The Air Ministry directive remained unchanged. The gap between doctrine and practice was managed informally, in the darkness of dispersal areas, by men who understood the actual problem better than the people who had written the rulebook. The Hurricane requires specific attention at this point, because the aircraft's role in the battle is consistently misrepresented by its absence from the visual iconography. The Spitfire was photogenic. Its lines were distinctive. Its association with the RAF's finest hour was immediately understood by the public, and the decision to use it as the primary recruitment and propaganda image of fighter command was a natural one. The statistics are less elegant. Historians working from confirmed loss records, most rigorously John Alcorn, cross-referencing RAF combat reports against Luftwaffe quartermaster data, have consistently concluded that the Hurricane accounted for approximately 55 to 60% of all German aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain, against the Spitfire's 42%. The standard tactical doctrine of the period directed Spitfires to engage the German fighter escort, while Hurricanes attacked the bombers, a doctrine that, in principle, used the faster, higher-performance aircraft against the faster, higher-performance targets. In practice, this distinction was frequently irrelevant once a raid arrived, and engagement geometry overrode planning. The Hurricane was slower than the Bf-109E in level flight by approximately 30 miles per hour, but its turning radius at low to medium altitude was superior. Its Merlin installation was more accessible to ground crews, and its construction was considerably more resistant to combat damage than the Spitfire's stressed-skin monocoque. Shot up and losing oil pressure, a Hurricane would frequently get its pilot home. A Spitfire in the same state was less forgiving. Minimum turnaround times for a Hurricane at frontline squadrons during the battle period have been reconstructed from a combination of maintenance records and crew memoirs, and the numbers are striking. A complete refuel and rearm, drain the fuel tanks, fill them to operational load, reload all 8 gun bays with fresh ammunition, run the engine checks, certify the aircraft serviceable, could be accomplished by an experienced 4-man ground crew in approximately 15 to 18 minutes under favorable conditions. Comparable figures for Spitfire servicing, from the same sources, ran somewhat longer due to the Spitfire's tighter access to certain service points, particularly the wing root gun bays, which required additional disassembly time. In a campaign where Park had to manage the timing of scrambles and recoveries against the threat of follow-up raids, and where an aircraft still being refueled when the next scramble went up was effectively a non-participant in the next engagement, those turnaround differentials were not trivial. The Hurricane's ground serviceability, its capacity to be ready again quickly, was a tactical asset that the performance comparison charts never captured. I find, reading through the maintenance literature from this period, that the detail that recurs most often and most vividly in ground crew memoirs is not the dramatic ones, not the aircraft that came back with half its tail shot away, or the pilot they had to help out of the cockpit because he couldn't lift his arms. The detail that recurs is the ordinary, repetitive, exhausting rhythm of the work. Open the cowlings, check the oil state, check the coolant level, open the gun bays, load the belts, close the gun bays, fuel the aircraft, run the engine for 2 minutes, certify it, close the cowlings, move to the next one. 4 aircraft per crew, 2 hours per full maintenance cycle, then sleep, if there was time, or food, or neither, and start again. The men who kept the RAF's aircraft flying through August and September 1940 were not doing something glamorous. They were doing something technically demanding, physically exhausting, and absolutely essential in conditions of constant alert on airfields that were being bombed and strafed by the same force their aircraft were supposed to be destroying. The operational diaries for most squadrons record the ground crew's contribution in the aggregate: aircraft available, aircraft unserviceable, sorties flown per day. The names are mostly absent. The work is present in every number, somewhere in the Supermarine production records, and in the memoirs of the pilots who flew early-build Spitfires. There is a detail that deserves to be stated plainly. On some aircraft delivered directly from the factory to maintenance units and then to squadrons during the accelerated production surge of the summer of 1940, the internal structural frames still carried chalk markings from the factory floor, fabrication notes, inspection dates, assembly annotations written by workers at Supermarine's Southampton facility during the build process. There had been no time, in the rush to get aircraft out of the factory and into service, to clean every internal surface before it was enclosed behind the skin panels. A pilot climbing into his Spitfire in August 1940 was, in a small but specific way, still carrying the handwriting of the woman or man who had assembled his aircraft a few weeks before. That connection, between the factory floor and the cockpit, between the civilian building and the pilot flying, was the real architecture of the Battle of Britain, not the duels in the sky, dramatic as those were. The chain that ran from the factory bench to the dispersal hardstand to the sky over London, and that ran on the labor of people whose names almost nobody recorded. Chapter 10. Black Thursday. The crisis deepens. The 24th of August, 1940. A line on a calendar. A date that looks, in retrospect, like the opening of the most dangerous phase of the battle. The 12 days in which the Luftwaffe came closer to breaking the Dowding system than at any other point in the campaign. Not by destroying more aircraft in the air, though it was doing that too, but by targeting the ground architecture that the air battle depended on. The sector stations that processed the radar plots, issued the scrambles, tracked the pilots, directed the engagements, and coordinated the recoveries. The operations rooms, the telephone exchanges, the fuel and ammunition stores, the runways that had to be serviceable for a squadron to return to them after a fight. Between the 24th of August and the 6th of September, 6 of the 7 sector stations in 11 Group were struck. Some were struck repeatedly. The cumulative effect on the system was not catastrophic, because Dowding had built redundancy into his architecture. But it was serious, and it was getting more serious with each passing day. Biggin Hill was attacked on the 18th of August, then again on the 30th. The second attack was decisive. 9 Junkers Ju-88 bombers made what the record describes as a surprise attack in the evening of the 30th of August, hitting the station in a tight pattern that cut all power, severed gas and water mains, destroyed workshops, stores, and WAAF quarters, and killed 39 people, RAF and civilian personnel, who were at their posts when the bombs arrived. 27 more were wounded. The station's operations room, a surface building that had been constructed quickly in 1939 for reasons of cost and convenience rather than survivability, was wrecked. Biggin Hill, one of the most important sector stations in 11 Group's network, a station from which 3 squadrons operated, and whose controller was responsible for the air defense of a significant corridor south of London, was temporarily non-functional. The system responded the way Dowding had designed it to respond. A reserve operations room, pre-planned and pre-equipped, took over sector control from a caravan and a field telephone exchange within hours. At reduced capacity, approximately 12 phone connections against the normal 35, but functioning, the sector's squadrons kept flying. Manston, the forward airfield on the Kent coast near Ramsgate, presents a different kind of evidence and a harder kind of story. The airfield was struck repeatedly through late August. Its position on the coastal front made it the most exposed operational facility in 11 Group's territory, within easy Bf 109 range from the Pas de Calais. The runways were cratered, buildings were damaged, shelters proved inadequate. An Air Ministry inquiry, conducted after the worst of the attacks, documented what the inquiry chose to describe as a breakdown in ground personnel morale during heavy raids. Personnel leaving their posts and sheltering in the surrounding countryside rather than remaining at their stations. The inquiry did not recommend disciplinary action. The inquiry's own findings suggest the investigators understood that what had happened at Manston was not a failure of individual courage, but a failure to provide adequate protection for people who were being asked to remain at their posts on an airfield being systematically destroyed. The incident was classified. It didn't appear in public accounts of the battle. It sat in the files until researchers found it decades later, and it tells a story about what sustained bombing without adequate shelter does to people that no official narrative was prepared to state plainly at the time. The operational damage reports flowing into the Uxbridge operations room through August told a compounding story. Hornchurch's runways were cratered, and its eastern dispersal area hit on the 30th and 31st of August. North Weald was struck on the 24th. Kenley, already damaged on the 18th, received further hits. Debden was attacked. Each attack, individually, produced damage that the RAF's repair organization worked quickly to address. Runway craters were filled within hours by civilian contractors under standing emergency contracts, and the RAF credited some remarkable turnaround times in its post-battle accounting. But repaired and fully operational were different conditions, and in the gap between them, while the runway was being filled, while the telephone exchange was running at reduced capacity, while the reserve ops room was handling less than half the normal information load, the sector was contributing less to the defense than it should have been, and the pilots flying from damaged facilities were doing so with less comprehensive ground support than the system was designed to provide. The pilot loss figures for this period compound the infrastructure problem in a way that the standard accounts usually treat as two separate stories. They weren't separate. A sector station operating at reduced capacity meant that its controller was working from less information, with less communication bandwidth, making intercept decisions on a picture that was less complete than normal. Into that degraded information environment, the RAF was simultaneously inserting replacement pilots with 2 weeks of operational training, men who, precisely because they were new, depended more heavily on good ground control direction than experienced pilots did. An experienced pilot with 50 operational hours could manage an intercept with patchy vector information. He could make reasonable tactical judgments with incomplete picture data. A pilot on his second or third sortie needed the ground controller's voice in his headset, telling him the height and bearing and number of the enemy, because he didn't yet have the accumulated pattern recognition that allowed you to read a contrail or a radar echo and deduce what it meant. The system was degrading at exactly the moment when its human components most needed it to be working at its best. Dowding's telegram of the 2nd of September sits in the Air Ministry files as the clearest single expression of where the campaign stood. He had examined his own returns, aircraft, pilots, station serviceability, and he had written that he could not guarantee the effective fighter defense of the country if losses continued at their present rate. The phrase, effective fighter defense, is doing specific work in that sentence. It doesn't mean fighter command ceases to exist. It means the system, the integrated, radar-cued, sector-controlled, pilot-directed system he had spent 4 years building and 4 years defending against budget pressure and institutional skepticism, would no longer be able to function as designed. It would still be flying aircraft. The radar would still be detecting raids. But the combination of infrastructure damage, pilot quality degradation, and experience attrition would have reached a point where the system's output, interceptions that disrupted German formations before they reached their targets, at an acceptable cost, could no longer be guaranteed. The Air Ministry received the telegram and filed it. There was nothing it could do. The plan was the plan. The historical debate about whether 11 Group was actually approaching breakdown during this 12-day period has generated more heat than most arguments in Battle of Britain historiography. Richard Overy's position, that the system was genuinely approaching systemic failure by September 6th, is challenged by John Ray's argument that 12 Group, intact and fresh in the Midlands, would have assumed the defense of southern England if 11 Group had needed to be temporarily stood down. Both arguments are defensible with evidence. What they're actually describing is two different questions. Overy is describing 11 Group's specific operational state, damaged, overextended, operating below its design parameters in multiple respects simultaneously. Ray is describing Fighter Command's institutional resilience, its capacity to absorb a temporary failure in one group and continue the defense from a fallback position. Both things were true. The system was approaching a condition that its designer had told the Air Ministry was unsustainable. The system also had backup provisions that might have kept the defense alive through a further week of that pressure. The honest answer is that we don't know precisely where the breaking point was, because the breaking point was never reached. The repair organization that worked alongside Fighter Command through August and September is almost entirely absent from the popular record, and this is a significant omission. The civilian contractors who filled runway craters at night, working under blackout, on airfields that were being hit repeatedly, with heavy equipment and materials staged at forward locations specifically for this purpose, were operating under emergency contracts that the Air Ministry had quietly negotiated months before the battle began. The Ministry of Works teams who rebuilt damaged operations rooms, who replaced severed telephone cables, who repaired the concrete aprons and hard standings that aircraft needed to taxi on. These men worked on a schedule that the squadrons flying from those airfields depended on absolutely. Their contribution doesn't appear in the order of battle. It doesn't appear in any strength return. It appears, indirectly, in the fact that stations that were categorically unusable on a Monday afternoon were categorically operational again by Wednesday morning, which is the kind of recovery that doesn't happen by itself. The 6th of September, 1940, the last day before the pivot. The sector stations of 11 Group are functioning, damaged, jury-rigged in places, operating through improvised arrangements in several locations, but functioning. The pilot reserves are thin and getting thinner. The OTU output is running below the weekly loss rate. The repair teams are working through another night on another set of cratered runways. Dowding's telegram is on file at the Air Ministry, unanswered because it cannot be answered in any meaningful way. And somewhere in the planning apparatus of the Luftwaffe, a different decision is being made. Or rather, the consequences of a different decision, made 2 weeks earlier on a dark night over the Thames estuary, are about to manifest. The bombs will fall on London tomorrow. The sector stations will have time to breathe. 12 days of systematic infrastructure destruction will pause. The system Dowding built will not be tested to the specific point his telegram described. In the end, it will have been close enough to matter, but not close enough to break. Chapter 11. The night they bombed the wrong city. The night of the 24th of August, 1940, the Thames is invisible below a layer of broken cloud. A formation of German bombers is over Essex, heading northwest. Their briefed target is Thameshaven, the oil storage complex at the Thames estuary, east of London's urban boundary, a legitimate military economic target that has been on Luftwaffe target lists since the beginning of the campaign. The lead navigator is working by dead reckoning. Airspeed known, compass heading known, elapsed flight time known, wind correction applied. But the wind has shifted since the pre-mission weather briefing. The cloud below is thicker than forecast, denying visual fixes on ground features. The Thames curves where the chart shows it running straight. The distance estimate runs ahead of the actual ground track, and when the bomb aimer calls release, the bombs fall not on the oil tanks at Thameshaven, but on Cripplegate, in the city of London, then on Islington, then on Bethnal Green, residential streets, people asleep in houses. The crews don't know they've missed. They see fires starting below them and record probable hit in the mission log and turn for home. What happened next runs like a mechanism. Churchill authorized RAF Bomber Command to attack Berlin the following night, the 25th of August. The raid took place. The navigation was equally imprecise. Berlin is not a small city, but reaching it from England required a round trip of approximately 8 hours at Bomber Command's operating speeds in 1940, over hostile territory, in darkness, by dead reckoning on a route that German night fighters were beginning to patrol. The bombs caused minimal damage. The Tempelhof Aerodrome and the Siemens factory works were listed as targets. Neither was meaningfully hit. What the raid produced was not material damage to Germany's war-making capacity. What it produced was the evidence, displayed by fire and smoke over the German capital, that British bombers could reach Berlin. Hitler had told the German public, repeatedly, that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb the Reich. On the night of the 25th of August, some did. The political consequence was documented in real time. Hitler was furious in a way that the conference records and the testimony of those present described as qualitatively different from his ordinary operational displeasure. The speech Hitler delivered at the Sportpalast in Berlin on the 4th of September, 1940, has been widely quoted and widely contextualized. What is sometimes missed in the contextualization is the specific operational consequence that followed directly from the speech's content. He threatened to erase British cities. He framed the Luftwaffe's forthcoming campaign against urban targets as retaliation for British bombing of German cities. The strategic argument within the German High Command, that breaking civilian morale would achieve what attacking airfields had not, was real, and it predated the London bombing accident. But the accident and its political consequences gave the argument momentum and gave Hitler a public commitment to follow through. Göring, who had his own reasons to want a campaign that might produce a dramatic, visible result after weeks of attrition that had achieved less than promised, supported the shift. The operational directive was issued. The Luftwaffe would turn toward London, and Keith Park, sitting in his underground operations room in Uxbridge, would receive the consequences of a navigation error made by a lost crew over the Thames estuary 2 weeks earlier. I want to be specific about the historical debate here because it matters. The dominant position in the historiography holds that the August 24th bombing was accidental, that the crews were genuinely lost, genuinely missed their target, and that no one in the German command structure intended to bomb London that night. The minority position holds that the prohibition on bombing London was not as firmly enforced at operational level as it was stated at command level, and that some crews may have interpreted their orders loosely enough to bring their bombs down inside the city limits. The evidence I've examined points more strongly toward the navigation error explanation. The pattern of bomb falls that night, distributed across Cripplegate, Islington, and Bethnal Green, is consistent with a formation that had drifted several miles northwest of its briefed run-in track, not consistent with a targeted attack on central London. But the alternative reading cannot be dismissed purely on the available evidence, because the German mission records for that night are incomplete. What I can say with confidence is that the consequences of whatever happened, accidental or otherwise, were more transformative than any deliberate operational plan the Luftwaffe executed during the whole of the Battle of Britain. The Heinkel HE-111H series, which carried the bomb load on this and hundreds of other missions through the summer and autumn of 1940, was a medium bomber with specific limitations that shaped what it could and couldn't accomplish. Its maximum operational bomb load was approximately 2,000 kilograms, though standard mission loads ran 1,000 to 1,400 kilograms to preserve range and fuel margins. The aircraft's internal bomb bay was vertical. Bombs were stored nose upward in the fuselage, which limited the maximum size of individual weapons the aircraft could carry without external modification. Its cruise speed at operational altitude was approximately 220 to 230 miles per hour, which gave it a somewhat predictable flight time from the Pas de Calais to central London of approximately 45 minutes, long enough for chain home to detect, filter room to process, and 11 group to begin scrambling intercepts, but short enough that the margin for error in those 8 minutes of average processing time was always tight. Navigating the aircraft to a precise target at night, in cloud, over a blacked-out country with no electronic navigation aids beyond the Nicobine beam system, required a standard of dead reckoning precision that was consistently optimistic in the operational conditions of 1940. The London fires of August 24th were modest by comparison with what would follow. The ARP incident logs record them with the administrative precision of people who had been trained for exactly this scenario: addresses, times, first responders, casualties, extinguishment status. What those logs also document, reading them in sequence, is the transition that the 24th of August represented, from a campaign of industrial and military targets to something that was, for the people of inner London, qualitatively different. The bombs on Cripplegate killed people who had nothing to do with the RAF, with radar stations, with aircraft production. They killed people in their houses and in the streets. And Churchill's immediate decision to retaliate against Berlin, taken within hours of receiving the damage reports, was framed, publicly and privately, as an act of measured response. It was also an act of deliberate political calculation, forcing Hitler into the specific emotional reaction that would redirect the Luftwaffe's campaign away from Fighter Command's infrastructure and toward a strategic objective, civilian morale, that the evidence already available from Poland, the Netherlands, and Spain suggested could not be achieved by aerial bombardment in any practical time frame. The RAF Bomber Command raids on Berlin between the 25th of August and the early days of September dropped approximately 81 tons of bombs in total across the raid series, a figure that needs to be stated in its material context. The Luftwaffe had dropped approximately 337 tons on London alone on the first day of the Blitz. The RAF's Berlin raids were not, in material terms, significant. The Gorlitzer railway station was hit in a subsequent attack. The Tempelhof aerodrome perimeter was struck, A small number of buildings and residential areas were damaged. 10 German civilians were killed across the raid series. Militarily, the damage was negligible. Politically, the damage to Hitler's credibility with the German public, who had been promised immunity from exactly this, was real and immediate. That disproportion between the material and the psychological consequence of the RAF's Berlin raids is one of the most striking examples in the entire war of a military action that achieved its purpose, not by what it destroyed, but by what it demonstrated. The chain of contingency that runs from a navigator's dead reckoning error over the Thames estuary on the night of August 24th, to the moment Fighter Command's pressure on its sector station infrastructure abruptly eased on the 7th of September is, by conventional historiographical standards, almost too clean. It has the quality of a mechanism. Error produces response, produces escalation, produces strategic shift, produces strategic relief. Historians are, rightly, suspicious of chains that tidy. The counter-argument, that the Luftwaffe was already considering a shift toward city targets before the London accident, that Göring was frustrated with the slow progress against Fighter Command and was looking for an alternative, has genuine archival support. The planning discussions about urban targeting predated August 24th. What the accident and its political consequences did was accelerate a shift that might have come anyway, and give it a public justification that made it harder to reverse. That distinction matters. But in the operational record, the timing is what it is. Fighter Command's airfields were being systematically degraded through the first days of September. Dowding had written to the Air Ministry about the sustainability of the defense, and the attack on the infrastructure stopped on the 7th of September and did not resume with the same intensity. Whatever caused the shift, the effect was real. Chapter 12. Black Saturday. The Blitz begins. The afternoon of the 7th of September, 1940. The weather over southern England is clear, unusually, beautifully clear for early September, with visibility that extends to the horizon, and contrails forming cleanly at high altitude. At chain home stations along the Kent and Sussex coasts, the cathode ray tubes are showing something that the operators would later describe, in various accounts, as unlike anything they'd seen before. The plot forming over the Pas de Calais was very large, too large to be a normal raid formation. The range marks and bearing assessments flowing back to filter room at Bentley Priory described a mass of aircraft covering a volume of airspace that the filter room's experienced assessors had to recalibrate their counting assumptions to process. 348 bombers, 617 fighter escorts, nearly 1,000 aircraft in a single coordinated formation, following the Thames upstream toward the largest city in Europe. The scramble orders went up across 11 Group as the formation crossed the coast at approximately 1600 hours. That's 4 in the afternoon. And the sector station controllers began vectoring their squadrons toward the positions they would have occupied to defend the airfields that had been the target every day for 2 weeks. That's the important detail in the initial response. The defense positioned to protect Biggin Hill and Hornchurch and Kenley, because those were the targets the Luftwaffe had been attacking for 12 days, and there was no particular operational reason to assume today would be different. The formation didn't break into airfield attack profiles. It stayed together. It turned northwest along the Thames toward London. Some 11 Group squadrons caught it in transit over Kent and engaged from forward positions. Others arrived over the city as the first bombs were already falling. The initial response was, by the operational records, less coordinated than usual, because the interception geometry had been set up for a target pattern that didn't materialize, and redirecting under fire against a formation that large took time that the situation didn't generously provide. The targets that the first wave struck were not chosen at random. The Surrey Commercial Docks, on the south bank of the Thames at Rotherhithe, held the largest timber importation facility in Europe, an open-air storage yard covering hundreds of acres, stacked with imported wood from Scandinavia and North America. Timber burns. The West India Docks, on the Isle of Dogs, handled West Indian sugar and rum and tropical produce. The Silvertown industrial area, just east of the Royal Docks, contained chemical works, rubber factories, and the gasometer that served industrial users across the eastern borough. From the perspective of Luftwaffe target planners, working from the pre-war economic intelligence surveys that their service had carefully compiled, these were legitimate military economic objectives, components of the imperial trade infrastructure that kept Britain's war economy supplied. They were also the places where tens of thousands of working-class East Londoners lived within a street's width of the industrial premises. The geography of London's East End did not separate warehouses and factories from the houses of the people who worked in them. It interlaced them, block by block. Bombing the docks meant bombing the streets. The fires that the first wave started were visible to the second wave. 247 bombers from Luftwaffe 3 that came in after dark and used the flames as a navigational guide. The London Fire Brigade logged 1,075 separate fires during the night of the 7th and 8th of September. 9 were classified as conflagrations, fires exceeding the suppressive capacity of available resources, fires that could not be fully controlled with what the brigade had available. 14 firemen were killed fighting the docks' fires. 250 more were injured during that first night alone. The Surrey commercial docks burned for days. The open-air timber stacks were vast enough that the fire services could not encircle them completely, and the fires had to be allowed to burn themselves out through the accessible wood while crews defended the perimeters against spread. The fires were visible from 30 miles. From the Kentish Hills, from the North Downs, from the upper floors of buildings in central London, the sky to the east was orange. The casualty count for the 7th of September, 1940, varies slightly depending on the source and the counting method. The Battle of Britain historical timeline records 448 people killed in the day's attacks, with 1,337 more seriously injured. The London Museum's Black Saturday account gives 430 killed. These are the casualties from a single afternoon and a single night. 430 people. They were not soldiers. They were not aircrew. They were dock workers and factory hands and shopkeepers and pensioners and children who happened to live in the postal districts that the docks complex had built around itself over 2 centuries of imperial trade. The official British civil defense apparatus, the ARP wardens, the fire service, the ambulance teams, the rescue parties, had been planning for exactly this, and the response was organized and substantial. It was also completely overwhelmed by the scale of what had arrived. From the underground operations room at Uxbridge, Park was watching a different picture. His squadrons had engaged the formation in transit and in the target area. Some had achieved good intercepts, others had arrived late or been positioned too far from the formation's actual route to engage effectively before the bombs fell. Fighter Command lost 23 fighters during the day's fighting, a significant number, but not catastrophic by the standards of the preceding 12 days. The German losses for the day were approximately 41 aircraft confirmed destroyed. But the information that mattered most to Park on the evening of the 7th of September wasn't the aircraft count. It was the status boards on the walls of his operations room, showing the sector stations of 11 Group. Biggin Hill, operative. Hornchurch, operative. Kenley, operative. North Weald, operative. All of them. None of them had been hit today. The formation hadn't been aimed at them. For the first time since the 24th of August, 11 Group's sector station network had come through a full day of intensive German operations without taking any additional infrastructure damage. The code word Cromwell was issued to Home Guard units across England on the night of the 7th of September. It was the invasion alert, the signal that enemy landings were imminent or had begun. Church bells, designated as the civilian invasion warning, were rung in several rural locations. Home Guard battalions stood to arms in the dark, manning their posts and roadblocks with whatever weapons they had been issued, waiting for the German paratroopers or the coastal landing that the code word implied was coming. No paratroopers came, no landing craft appeared. The Cromwell issue was, in retrospect, a misreading of the tactical situation. Someone in the chain from intelligence assessment to Home Guard command had interpreted the sudden dramatic escalation of bombing attacks on London as the preliminary to a seaborne assault, rather than as a strategic reorientation within the air campaign. The mistake was corrected, and the stand-down issued. The church bells fell silent, the Home Guard went back to their houses, and London kept burning. The question of whether the shift to bombing London was a strategic error by the Germans is one that historians have been discussing since the autumn of 1940, and the honest answer is more complicated than the "it saved Fighter Command" narrative usually allows. The Luftwaffe was not in a position, by the 7th of September, to destroy Fighter Command in a week of further airfield attacks, even if the sector station infrastructure had been somewhat degraded. The attrition the Germans would have had to sustain to complete the destruction of 11 Group's ground network, given the RAF's production surplus, the the resilience of the sector station architecture, and the ongoing pilot replacement, however inadequate, was greater than their own operational losses could sustain indefinitely. The shift to London may have shortened the battle considerably by allowing Fighter Command's infrastructure time to recover that it wouldn't otherwise have had. But the claim that Fighter Command was on the edge of decisive collapse on September 7th is disputed by enough serious historians that it should not be stated as settled fact. What can be stated plainly is this: after September 7th, the infrastructure attacks stopped, the stations recovered, the production surplus kept building, and the battle, from that day, was going in a direction that only one side could follow to its conclusion. Chapter 13, September 15th, The Numbers That Won. The morning of the 15th of September 1940 arrives over southern England in good flying weather. Visibility clear, cloud base high, the kind of morning that makes aircraft performance everything. At Castle Bromwich, north of Birmingham, the day shift at the Spitfire factory is already underway. By 8 in the morning, 6 newly completed Spitfire Mark Is have been signed off through final inspection and dispatched to maintenance units for delivery to Fighter Command. 6 aircraft, not a dramatic number, not the kind of number that appears in dispatches or Churchill's memoirs or the RAF Museum's battle commemorations. But 6 Spitfires leaving a factory in Birmingham on the morning of the 15th of September, 1940, is the figure that tells you something the combat record can't tell you on its own. That the factories had not just survived the summer, but had outrun it. That the production war was settled, and that whatever happened in the air over London today, the RAF would have more aircraft tomorrow than it had yesterday. That was a statement the Luftwaffe could not make. The first German wave crossed the Kent coast at approximately 11 in the morning. Approximately 100 bombers with fighter escort. The formation tracked by chain home from 40 minutes out. The plot flowing to Bentley Priory, then to Uxbridge, then to the sector stations, then to the squadron dispersals, where pilots were already sitting in their aircraft with engines warm. The scramble orders went up across 11 Group. Park committed his squadrons in a deliberately graduated sequence, using the chain home plot's advance warning time to ensure that squadrons could gain altitude before the intercept, rather than meeting the Germans in a climbing attack from below. From Duxford, the Big Wing, 5 squadrons from 12 Group under Douglas Bader's command began its assembly. The assembly took time. It always took time. The 5 squadrons forming up over the Cambridgeshire airfield had to orbit, burning fuel in minutes, before the 60 aircraft formation could fly south toward the battle area. This was, for the 100th time that summer, the fundamental problem with the Big Wing. The time it took to assemble was time the German formation spent unimpeded, and by the time the wing reached London's outskirts, many of 11 Group's engagements were already concluded. The first wave was met heavily over Kent and southeast London. Multiple 11 Group squadrons engaged the German formation in overlapping intercepts, attacking from different altitudes and directions, as Park's controllers vectored each squadron to its assigned intercept position. The fighting was confused and fast, scattered over a wide area of airspace. Multiple aircraft engaged simultaneously, the radio frequencies crowded with position calls and attack warnings. German bomber formations that had flown in tight, mutually supporting groups through the previous weeks, began to break up under the pressure of repeated attacks from well-positioned British fighters. And once a bomber formation broke, its individual aircraft became isolated and vulnerable in ways that a coherent group was not. The Dorniers and Heinkels that reached London's eastern and southern outskirts released their bombs, some accurately on the areas they'd been assigned, others in the haste and disruption of continuous fighter attack, and turned for France, passing back through the fighter cover that was thinning as the Bf 109 escort reached the limits of its fuel state and began the return flight it couldn't delay. Churchill arrived at Uxbridge at approximately 10:30, in time to watch the morning engagement from the balcony. He'd been here before. He understood the system. He watched the board on the wall as the squadron indicators moved through their states, available, at readiness, airborne, in combat. And he asked Park, at some point in the afternoon when the second wave was building, and every indicator on the wall was showing a squadron either airborne or returning, what reserves remained. Park's answer, none, has passed into the popular record as the dramatic center of the battle's most celebrated day. And it was genuinely dramatic. The system had committed everything it had. But none didn't mean nothing remained. It meant that everything available had been committed, which was not the same thing as everything was exhausted. In the depots and the maintenance units, Beaverbrook's accumulated stockpile was there. 270 serviceable Hurricanes and Spitfires, held in reserve against precisely this kind of operational maximum. Park had no immediate tactical reserves, at that moment, for an additional scramble. He had, behind that moment, a production surplus that guaranteed he would have more aircraft tomorrow than he had today. The afternoon brought the second German wave, approximately 300 aircraft, again heading for London, again met by every squadron Park could put in the air, again intercepted across Kent and Surrey in engagements that ranged from the coast to the Thames. The fighting through the afternoon was as intense as the morning, and the German formations, already tired from the morning's combat and having had to reassemble over France before the second sortie, flew into a defense that was not, despite having committed everything available, broken or diminished. They met fresh squadrons that had landed, refueled, and rearmed in the hours between waves. They met the coherent vector information from sector controllers, who were working from an undamaged network, because the Blitz, having begun 8 days earlier, had spared 11 Group's infrastructure from further systematic attack. The operational picture that the Germans encountered over London on the afternoon of September 15th was not the picture of a shattered air force clinging to its last reserves. It was the picture of a functioning system that had recovered, over 8 days without airfield attacks, from the worst of the August crisis. The aircraft loss figures for September 15th have been through more revision than any other day of the campaign, and the process of revision is itself instructive. Churchill told Parliament that 185 German aircraft had been destroyed. The Air Ministry subsequently reduced this to 56 confirmed. Post-war cross-referencing against Luftwaffe quartermaster records, conducted most systematically by researchers working from both the British and German archival sides, produces a figure of approximately 61 German aircraft confirmed destroyed, with additional aircraft damaged seriously enough that some may have been written off after returning to French bases. The RAF lost 29 fighters. The exchange ratio, roughly 2 German aircraft for each British one, was favorable but not historically remarkable. The RAF had achieved comparable exchange rates on multiple days through August, without the day being declared decisive. What made September 15th decisive was not the exchange ratio, it was the operational context. The Luftwaffe had committed its maximum effort and had met a defense that was stronger, not weaker, than a month earlier. The Big Wing's contribution to the day is a question the records resist answering cleanly. The Duxford Wing arrived over the London area after the first wave's engagements were mostly concluded, encountering dispersed and retreating German formations rather than the tight, coherent bomber streams that 11 Group squadrons had engaged during the initial interceptions. Bader's claim figures for the day were large. How many of those claims correspond to confirmed German losses from independent verification remains genuinely uncertain, because the overlapping nature of the engagement, multiple British squadrons claiming the same aircraft in the confusion of a large dispersed battle, was exactly the overcounting problem that had run through RAF kill claims since the beginning of the Kanalkampf. What the Big Wing indisputably accomplished on September 15th was the psychological effect of presenting a large, coherent British formation to German crews who had expected to meet diminishing opposition. Seeing 60 British fighters overhead, in formation, 9 weeks into a campaign that was supposed to have destroyed them, was a message the Luftwaffe could read clearly. Whether that message was worth the assembly delay and the fuel cost is still, depending on which historian you're reading, an open question. The production numbers for the week ending September 15th are the ones that I keep returning to, because they contain the actual explanation for why the day was decisive, in a way that the combat figures don't. In that single week, the Ministry of Aircraft Production delivered approximately 120 new Hurricanes and Spitfires to Fighter Command's maintenance units. Fighter Command lost 55 fighters in operations during the same week. Net gain, 65 aircraft. This was the first clearly positive production balance in 5 weeks. The stockpile was growing again. The attrition curve, which had been running ahead of the replacement curve through the worst of August, had definitively turned. Castle Bromwich had produced 56 Spitfires in September alone by the 15th of the month, a number that would have been considered impossible as late as May, when the factory was still fighting through its production reorganization crisis. The workers who achieved that number, roughly 30% of them women, all of them working extended shifts under emergency production conditions, are not commemorated anywhere in the Battle of Britain's public mythology. They are present, in the aggregate, in a production number in a Ministry of Aircraft Production weekly return. By the evening of September 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe's planning staff were facing a calculation they couldn't make come out right. Their crews had flown twice that day against what was supposed to be a nearly exhausted defense, and had been met, both times, by coherent and numerous British fighter opposition. The claimed RAF losses were high. They were always high, because overclaiming in combat was structural. But the evidence in front of every German crew member who had made the crossing was the evidence of their own experience. The British were still there. More squadrons than expected, better positioned than expected, less damaged looking than the intelligence picture had led them to expect. On the 19th of September, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The decision wasn't solely the result of September 15th. The broader strategic position, the approaching autumn weather, the Royal Navy's presence in home waters, and raiders' persistent naval skepticism all contributed. But September 15th provided the specific operational evidence that the prerequisite for Sea Lion, the destruction of RAF Fighter Command, had not been achieved and was not going to be achieved on any timeline that autumn permitted. Chapter 14. The Big Wing Controversy. A Battle Within the Battle. There's a particular kind of damage that doesn't show up in aircraft loss tallies or pilot casualty rolls. On the 17th of October, 1940, the Air Ministry in London held a meeting that began at 11 in the morning and ended Britain's most capable air defense commander by lunchtime. The room held air marshals, air vice marshals, and one squadron leader, Douglas Bader, the legless pilot of No. 242 Squadron, who'd been invited to speak directly to senior staff officers, as if the distinction of rank had simply ceased to matter. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding arrived, expecting to present a summary of a battle he'd just won. What he found was a tribunal. Chief of the Air Staff Cyril Newall, who'd arranged the meeting, was absent sick. The chair had been taken by his deputy, Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, who'd been maneuvering against Dowding behind the scenes for months. Dowding didn't know the chair had changed hands until he entered the room and looked at who was sitting at the head of the table. He sat down anyway. That steadiness, that refusal to react, was both his finest quality and the one that let his enemies read silence as weakness. The tactical disagreement that served as pretext for the meeting had been burning since August. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding No. 12 Group north of the Thames, had spent the summer arguing that Fighter Command's practice of scrambling small flights, 3 to 12 aircraft at a time, to intercept incoming raids was a waste of force. His alternative, championed loudly by Bader, was to assemble formations of 5 full squadrons, 60 or more aircraft, before engaging the enemy. This was the big wing, concentrated, devastating in theory, overwhelming on paper. The assembly time for a wing of 60 aircraft above Duxford was, in practice, between 12 and 25 minutes. No. 11 Group's sector airfields in Kent and Surrey, the ones absorbing the actual bombing during August and September, were being hit within 8 minutes of radar detection. Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, ran those numbers daily. The big wing, as an interceptor of incoming raids over 11 Group's territory, was geometrically incapable of arriving in time to protect the stations it was supposed to help. Park said so repeatedly. Lee Mallory said it didn't matter, that even arriving after the bombers had turned for home meant you could still hurt them on the way out. The two men had come to despise each other, in the precise, quiet way that RAF officers managed professional hatred, through memoranda, through forwarded reports, through carefully phrased letters to the Air Ministry that arrived on Douglas's desk and were read with warm appreciation. The October 17th meeting lasted several hours. Squadron leader Bader gave what multiple witnesses described as a lecture, not a briefing, a lecture, to assembled senior officers, arguing that the big wing had been decisive on September 15th, Battle of Britain Day, when his Duxford wing had claimed 105 destroyed, 40 probably destroyed, and 18 damaged for the loss of 14 RAF aircraft. Those figures were Lee Mallory's numbers, submitted to the Air Ministry in a Wing Patrol report dated the same week. Actual German losses on September 15th were later confirmed at around 61 aircraft. The big wing had not been overhead when the first wave struck London. It arrived, partially formed, some squadrons still joining, after the bombers had already released and turned. Flight Lieutenant Blackwood, who flew with No. 12 Group, said later that the wing often disintegrated almost immediately when combat was joined. Flying Officer Brinsden described the formation as a disaster that achieved nothing tactically because cohesion collapsed the moment anyone broke away to fire. None of these voices were invited to the October 17th meeting. Only Bader spoke for the pilots. I find it impossible to read the October 17th meeting minutes, which exist in the National Archives, catalogued under AIR 2/7281, without a slow, creeping fury. What the record shows is not a genuine tactical review. Dowding submitted Park's compiled data on sortie times, interception rates, and airfield damage to the Air Ministry on the 15th of November, after the meeting, as a kind of post-facto rebuttal. But by then, the decision had already been made. Douglas chaired proceedings in Newall's absence and essentially used Bader as an exhibit. When Air Marshal Portal, the one genuinely skeptical voice in the room, asked Lee Mallory how a concentrated big wing could defend its home territory if all its strength were massed elsewhere, Lee Mallory assured him that satisfactory plans were prepared. Portal did not press the point. Dowding was not consulted on what questions would be asked. He answered what he was asked and offered nothing else. He'd been ambushed and he knew it. He also knew, from 4 years of bureaucratic warfare, that saying so out loud would change nothing. The geometry of the big wing argument is worth pressing into actual numbers, because historians have sometimes allowed the emotional drama of Dowding's dismissal to obscure the technical case. ABF 109 at maximum cruise speed, approximately 285 miles per hour, covered the 22 miles from Cap Gris-Nez to the English coast in just under 5 minutes. Radar detection range at medium altitude was approximately 120 miles, giving No. 11 Group's operations room a theoretical warning window of 25 to 30 minutes. In practice, after radar data had been filtered through Bentley Priory and transmitted to sector stations, controllers had roughly 12 to 18 minutes from the moment a raid was confirmed before German fighters crossed the coast. A big wing assembling at Duxford needed 15 to 25 minutes of clear airspace and radio discipline to form up, more in bad weather or after a scramble from a cold readiness state. Park's tactic of launching sections of 3 and pairs of sections in sequence, each engaging the raid at a different point, forcing Luftwaffe escorts to divide attention, was not timid. It was the only tactic that fit the warning window. Lee Mallory operated over territory that, by the summer's geographic logic of the battle, received more warning time. He never fought a defensive engagement under Park's constraints and never acknowledged that difference publicly. The downstream damage of the controversy is visible in the personnel ledger. On the 25th of November 1940, Dowding was replaced as Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command by Sholto Douglas. On the 15th of December, Park was removed from No. 11 Group and replaced by Lee Mallory. Douglas and Lee Mallory, both big wing advocates, now controlled the command and the group that would have to learn, painfully, over the following year, that the offensive sweeps they championed over occupied France in 1941 produced loss rates among RAF pilots that dwarfed anything Park had accepted in the summer of 1940. The circus operations of 41 and 42, bomber raids escorted by large fighter wings intended to provoke Luftwaffe response, produced a ratio of roughly 1.8 British fighters lost for every German aircraft destroyed. Park's ratio over No. 11 Group in the summer of 1940 had been, on most days, approximately 1 to 1.2 in the RAF's favor. Park had already been told informally in October that his posting was being changed. He requested, and was denied, a formal review of the October 17th proceedings. He was given command of No. 23 Group, a training formation, the RAF's institutional equivalent of a filing cabinet for inconvenient heroes. In a letter written years later and archived at the Imperial War Museum, Park described the October 17th meeting as a Star Chamber trial. He was not given the opportunity to cross-examine Bader's claims or to present his own sortie data before the assembled air marshals. The Air Ministry subsequently produced its own account of the Battle of Britain. The official pamphlet titled The Battle of Britain, an Air Ministry Account, in which Dowding's name appeared nowhere in the principal narrative. Churchill was shown the pamphlet and wrote to Secretary of State for Air, Archibald Sinclair, in furious terms. His letter quoted directly, "The jealousies and cliquism which have led to the committing of this offense are a discredit to the Air Ministry, and I do not think any other service department would have been guilty of such a piece of work." He compared the omission to telling the story of Trafalgar without mentioning Lord Nelson. The pamphlet was eventually amended, but the original exclusion tells you everything about the professional culture that had swallowed Dowding. The historiographical question that genuinely remains open, and I want to be clear that it is open, not settled, is the degree to which Leigh-Mallory actively conspired against Dowding versus whether he genuinely believed in the big wing and pursued it through the normal channels of Air Ministry politics. Flight Lieutenant Peter MacDonald, adjutant of No. 242 Squadron and a sitting member of Parliament, had a private meeting with Churchill in which he apparently raised the big wing controversy. Sir Dennis Crowley Milling, who flew with No. 242, stated categorically in a post-war interview that Bader and Leigh-Mallory had no knowledge of MacDonald's approach to the Prime Minister. If that's accurate, then part of what destroyed Dowding was a backbench MP acting on his own initiative, a piece of shrapnel, not a directed weapon. But Sholto Douglas's fingerprints are harder to dismiss. He had been in correspondence with Leigh-Mallory throughout the summer, receiving wing patrol reports that didn't travel the normal chain of command. He chaired the October 17th meeting only because Newall fell ill, a coincidence of timing that, given what followed, one historian has called suspiciously convenient. None of this reaches the legal threshold of conspiracy. It doesn't need to. In institutions, coordinated ambiguity serves the same function as deliberate plotting. Everyone's hands stay clean. The outcome arrives just the same. Dowding submitted his formal dispatch, the official commander's account of the Battle of Britain, on the 20th of August, 1941, 9 months after his dismissal. It was not published. The Air Ministry held it. The September 1946 publication in the London Gazette came 6 years after the battle, long after the institutional politics had calcified into official history, long after the pilots who might have contested its framings had scattered across post-war careers and families and the ordinary business of survival. The dispatch runs to dozens of paragraphs and demonstrates, in its careful, non-accusatory language, a man who understood exactly what had happened to him and had chosen to let the record speak rather than the complaint. He mentions the big wing controversy once, obliquely, without naming Leigh-Mallory. It is the most controlled piece of writing I've read from any military commander in this period. Controlled in the way that grief is controlled, which is to say, it costs something to maintain. By the spring of 1941, the night blitz that had prompted the Air Ministry's urgency about Dowding's supposed failure to adapt had produced exactly the result Dowding had predicted. Hurricanes flying in the dark found nothing. The Bristol Beaufighter, equipped with airborne radar, the AI Mark IV, began operational night intercepts in November 1940, and by spring 41 was achieving genuine results, exactly as Dowding had argued it would. Sholto Douglas took credit for the program's eventual success. Leigh-Mallory lost his life in August 1944, killed when his aircraft struck a mountain in the French Alps while he was en route to command Allied air forces in Southeast Asia. He left no memoir, no final account, no post-war clarification of his role in the controversy. Dowding outlived him by 26 years, dying in February 1970 at the age of 87. He'd spent the intervening decades largely ignored by the institution he'd saved. The question of whether that constitutes a tragedy or merely an institutional adjustment depends, I think, entirely on what you believe institutions owe to the people who hold them together when it matters most. Chapter 15. The Not So Few. Allied Pilots and the International Dimension. The phrase, "the few," comes from Churchill's speech of the 20th of August, 1940, delivered to the House of Commons. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The phrase entered legend immediately and has distorted understanding of the battle's personnel composition ever since. Of the 2,936 aircrew who flew at least one operational sortie for fighter command between the 10th of July and the 31st of October 1940, 595, roughly 20%, were not British. They came from 23 countries. 14 flew from Poland, 12 from Czechoslovakia. 1 flew from Jamaica. The word few was Churchill's poetic compression of a geopolitical coalition into a single syllable of British pride. It was a magnificent sentence. It was also, in a documentary sense, incomplete. The Polish contribution to the Battle of Britain requires its own arithmetic before it can be understood. By the summer of 1940, Poland had been occupied for nearly a year. Polish pilots who'd escaped through Romania and then France, some of them flying combat operations against the Luftwaffe in the September 1939 campaign, and then again in France in May and June of 40, arrived in Britain carrying operational experience that most RAF pilots their age simply didn't possess. The Air Ministry's initial response to this pool of combat veterans was to subject them to English language aptitude tests and RAF procedure assessments, which delayed their operational deployment by weeks. Polish pilots who had already shot down German aircraft found themselves sitting through classroom instruction on RAF radio procedure. The bureaucratic friction was real and documented. Many Polish pilots were assigned to operational training units and kept there through July, while number 11 group squadrons were being ground down to a fraction of their establishment strength. The decision to keep experienced combat pilots in training, while less experienced British pilots flew operations, is one of the quieter institutional failures of the early battle period. Number 303 Squadron, the Kosciuszko Squadron, named after the Polish general who'd fought in the American Revolution, was formed at RAF Northolt on the 2nd of August 1940. The squadron was equipped with Hurricane Mark I fighters and assigned British officers as commanding officer and flight commanders, partly because the Air Ministry doubted the English language competency of Polish officers in command positions. Squadron leader Zdzisław Krasnodębski served as Polish commanding officer within the unit. The formal RAF command structure sat above him. The squadron was declared not yet operational. Training continued. Then, on the 31st of August, Flying Officer Ludwik Paskiewicz was participating in a training exercise over Hertfordshire when he broke formation without authorization, dived on a formation of BF-100s, and shot one down before returning to the landing circuit. The aircraft was confirmed destroyed. His commanding officer was furious at the breach of discipline. The Air Ministry subsequently declared number 303 operational the same evening, 3 weeks ahead of schedule. Sometimes, the bureaucratic timeline and the combat timeline resolved their disagreement in a single afternoon. In 42 days of operations, from the 1st of September to the 11th of October, when the squadron was withdrawn for rest, number 303 Squadron was credited with 126 aircraft destroyed. This figure has been contested. The skeptics' stack exchange analysis of the combat reports, cross-referencing with German loss records, found 44 confirmed kills that matched documented Luftwaffe losses. The claimed figure of 126 reflects the same overclaiming pattern present throughout fighter command. Multiple pilots firing at the same aircraft and each recording a kill in good faith. In the chaos of combat where a smoking aircraft last seen diving didn't always mean a destroyed one. The adjusted figure of 44 confirmed is still the highest for any Hurricane squadron in the battle, and represents an operational tempo that left the squadron's Hurricanes requiring near-continuous maintenance. 9 of the squadron's pilots qualified as aces, 5 or more confirmed kills each. Sergeant Józef František, a Czech national flying with the Poles, was credited with 17 confirmed kills, the highest tally of any single pilot in fighter command during the official battle period, though his combat style, breaking from formation to hunt individually, was a persistent disciplinary problem that his commanding officers tolerated because the results were undeniable. Witold Urbanowicz became Polish commanding officer of number 303 on the 5th of September, following Krasnodębski's wounding in combat. He scored 15 confirmed kills during the battle period, flying a Hurricane Mark I with serial number V6665 as his primary aircraft. His combat reports, several of which survive at the Polish Institute and Sikorsky Museum in London, describe engagements in a prose style that is entirely different from British combat reports of the period. Where RAF combat reports typically use passive construction and hedged language, enemy aircraft believed destroyed, claim 1 Bf-109 probably destroyed. Urbanovich's reports are direct and granular. He notes angles of approach, deflection estimates, the behavior of the target aircraft before it broke apart, the smell of cordite in the cockpit on the return leg. He was 28 years old, which made him one of the older pilots in fighter command. He'd been flying military aircraft since 1932. When the Air Ministry's training apparatus was reducing OTU courses to 2 weeks for British pilots born in 1921, Urbanovitz had already accumulated 8 years of professional flying. The Czech contribution is smaller in headline numbers, but equally precise in texture. 88 Czechoslovak pilots flew in the battle across several squadrons, most prominently No. 310 Squadron, based at Duxford, which was declared operational on the 17th of August, one of the few non-British units to reach operational status before the battle's most intense phase. No. 310 flew as part of No. 12 Group, which meant its operational record is partly entangled with the Big Wing controversy. The squadron flew Hurricane Mark I aircraft, the same type as No. 303, and its pilots brought the same pattern of pre-war experience. Most had flown in the Czechoslovak Air Force before the German occupation of March 1939, and several had flown combat in France before the armistice. The squadron's first combat came on the 26th of August, when it intercepted a formation of Heinkel HE-100s and 11s over Essex. Sergeant Bohumil First, who flew in that engagement, described later the peculiar sensation of flying against the Luftwaffe aircraft he'd been told, years earlier, were invincible. They were not invincible, he said in a post-war interview. They caught fire the same as ours. The Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian contributions are documented in aggregate numbers that conceal individual specificity. 112 Canadians flew in the battle, 127 New Zealanders, 32 Australians. The New Zealand total is particularly striking, given that New Zealand's entire population in 1940 was under 1,700,000 people. These pilots had come through the Empire Air Training Scheme and its predecessor programs, many of them trained in Canada or in Britain itself, and they were integrated into RAF squadrons on an individual basis rather than as national units. Their combat records are distributed across dozens of squadron operation record books, held at the National Archives in Kew, where their entries sit alphabetically alongside British surnames, with no national flag to mark them. Flight Lieutenant Al Deere, of No. 54 Squadron, a New Zealander who'd survived several emergency bailouts, including one where he was struck on the head by the propeller of the aircraft he just rammed, noted in a 1942 memoir that he never thought of himself as a foreign pilot. He thought of himself as a No. 54 Squadron pilot. The distinction is worth noting because it cuts against the narrative of an organically unified British battle. The administrative indignities suffered by non-British pilots were real and are documented in Air Ministry records. Polish and Czech officers above the rank of flying officer were not recognized at equivalent RAF ranks for pay purposes until November 1940, after the battle had effectively concluded. Polish pilots who were killed in combat received lower rates of dependency pension than their British equivalents. Several Polish pilots held pre-war rank as majors or colonels in the Polish Air Force and flew the battle as flight sergeants in the RAF because their credentials hadn't been validated quickly enough through official channels. The Air Ministry's June 1940 assessment of Polish pilots, which survives at the National Archives, describes them collectively as apt in the air, but notes concerns about irregularity of conduct, which appears to mean they sometimes broke formation to engage the enemy when the engagement opportunity was clearly there and the orders hadn't yet caught up. The complaint reads, from a 21st century distance, as deeply strange. The RAF was running out of pilots, and the Luftwaffe was running bombing missions over England daily, and the official concern in that June document was that Polish veterans were too aggressive. One figure that doesn't appear in the official casualty rolls, but belongs in any honest account of the battle's international dimension, is the number of non-British pilots who didn't survive the war. Of the 595 non-British pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain, the majority of Polish and Czech pilots who survived 1940 went on to fly further operations. In the Battle of the Atlantic, in the bomber command raids over Germany, in the fighter sweeps over France, their loss rates over the course of the war were significantly higher than those of their British counterparts, partly because many continued flying operational tours after the point at which British pilots were routinely rotated out. Witold Urbanowicz survived. Joseph František didn't. He was killed on the 8th of October, 1940, when his Hurricane crashed near Ewell in Surrey during what appeared to be a solo patrol. He was 26 years old. His crash is still labeled cause unknown in RAF records. The ambiguity is its own kind of document. I think often about the administrative sequencing that kept experienced pilots on the ground during the most dangerous weeks of the battle. There's something about that gap between what the records show was available and what was actually deployed that resists the clean narrative of national triumph. The Battle of Britain was won by a coalition managed by an institution that was simultaneously capable of extraordinary systemic brilliance: the Dowding system, the chain home network, the sector control architecture, and capable of wasting weeks of experienced pilots' time on English-language procedure tests while its squadrons bled. Both things are true. The brilliant system and the bureaucratic waste inhabited the same organization in the same summer. That's not a paradox. It's how large institutions actually operate, in any era. The wonder isn't that the system had failures. The wonder is that the good pieces held together well enough, long enough, for the failures not to matter. Chapter 16. Operation Sea Lion, Why the Invasion Never Came. On the 16th of July 1940, Adolf Hitler signed Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for a landing operation against England to be ready by mid-August, if necessary. The directive's language is studiously conditional. If necessary appears in the first paragraph. If air superiority cannot be established, appears by the third. Most historians read those hedges as evidence that Hitler never committed to the invasion in the way he'd committed to the fall of France, the occupation of Poland, or the eventual Operation Barbarossa. What the Wehrmacht's planning staff did in the 6 weeks following Directive 16 provides a more granular answer. They assembled a transport fleet, produced crossing timelines, assigned beach sectors, and drew up detailed orders of march. And in doing so, discovered that the operation faced logistical obstacles that no degree of Luftwaffe victory could resolve. The Battle of Britain is often framed as the reason Sea Lion didn't happen. It was a reason, not the only one. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, had been privately skeptical of Sea Lion from the moment the concept appeared on his desk. His objections were not philosophical. They were naval engineering. The English Channel between Cap Gris-Nez and Dover is 22 miles wide at its narrowest, but the crossing corridor that the Wehrmacht's army planners envisioned, running from Calais to a beachhead stretching from Ramsgate to Lyme Bay, a frontage of approximately 190 miles, required a crossing zone that exposed any convoy to the full north-south wind fetch of the southern North Sea. Raeder's staff calculated that the minimum sea state tolerable for the loading and unloading of heavy equipment was Force 2, winds under 11 miles per hour, wave heights under 1.5 meters. The English Channel experiences Force 3 or above on approximately 40% of all days between July and October. The invasion window, already compressed by Hitler's demand for a mid-August readiness date, was being further compressed by hydrology. The transport fleet that the Kriegsmarine assembled between July and September 1940 is one of the most studied logistical documents of the Second World War. By early September, German harbors from Rotterdam to Le Havre held approximately 1,277 river barges, 170 cargo ships, and 1,600 motorboats. The river barges are the crux of the problem. They were Rhine and Elbe commercial barges, designed for inland waterway transit in current-assisted channels. Their freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the deck edge, was typically between 18 inches and 2 feet. A wave height of 1 meter, not unusual in the channel at any point in the summer, would wash directly over the deck of a loaded Rhine barge. The barges had no independent propulsion. They required tugs to cross, and the tug stock assembled by late August was sufficient to move approximately 1/3 of the barge fleet at a time. To deliver the 13 infantry divisions earmarked for the first wave, approximately 170,000 men, the Kriegsmarine calculated a crossing time of 3 days under optimal conditions. Under typical September channel conditions, the estimate stretched to 5 days. Under any conditions involving Royal Navy interference, the planning assumption collapsed entirely. The Royal Navy's position in the Channel is the element of the Sea Lion calculation that receives the least attention in British popular history, perhaps because it doesn't fit the RAF narrative. At the beginning of September 1940, the Home Fleet and the forces assigned to the Channel Command included approximately 68 destroyers in active commission, with a further 21 in refit. Raeder's surface fleet available for Channel operations consisted of 4 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and approximately 20 torpedo boats, forces so inferior in tonnage to the Royal Navy that German naval planners privately referred to the proposed crossing as passing through a British minefield in a leaking boat. The Royal Navy had laid approximately 3,000 mines in the channel by early September. The minefields were mapped in German intelligence summaries, but the sweeping capacity of the available Kriegsmarine minesweepers was insufficient to clear a lane quickly enough, under fire, to maintain convoy throughput. Admiral Raeder's staff memo of the 29th of July, 1940, often cited as his most explicit objection to Sea Lion, described the operation's prerequisites as requiring air superiority over the channel, destruction of the Royal Navy's channel forces, and the clearing of mine barriers. He noted that achieving all three simultaneously before the autumn storm season began was, in his professional assessment, not achievable. The Wehrmacht's army planners had a different problem. They'd won France in 40 days using armored columns supported by close air support, operating on a front where supply lines ran overland and could be improvised as the advance accelerated. The Sea Lion plan asked them to land infantry across a beach assault without air support below low cloud cover, against an opponent whose mobile reserve, approximately 25 home divisions and approximately 450 operational tanks, could be concentrated on the beachhead within 48 hours. The German armor earmarked for the crossing included panzer units whose tanks were modified for shallow water swimming by sealing their hulls and fitting snorkels, an improvisation tested in the Baltic in calm conditions, with mixed results. The tanks were to drive off barges in chest-deep water, navigate to the beach by compass heading, and link with infantry who'd already secured the shoreline. The British Army in August 1940 was rebuilding from Dunkirk, re-equipping on American-supplied weapons, and genuinely weakened as a fighting force. But a weakened army defending prepared positions, with a functioning rail network for rapid redeployment, was a fundamentally different problem than the defeated French armies of May. The Wehrmacht's planners understood this. Their crossing timeline assumed no substantial British counterattack for the first 72 hours, an assumption built on optimism about air supremacy, Royal Navy suppression, and logistical success, all three of which remained unresolved. Hitler postponed Sea Lion on the 17th of September, 1940, 2 days after Battle of Britain Day. The postponement directive used the phrase, "until further notice," and set no new readiness date. The invasion barges, which had been concentrated in channel ports from Rotterdam to Cherbourg, were visible to RAF reconnaissance aircraft from late August, and had been subject to bomber command attacks throughout September. By the date of postponement, approximately 12% of the assembled barge fleet had been destroyed or damaged by bombing and mining. The remainder were dispersed over the following weeks to reduce their vulnerability as a target set. On the 12th of October, Hitler formally deferred Sea Lion to the spring of 1941. In July 1941, 3 weeks after Barbarossa began, the deferral was extended indefinitely. The invasion fleet was never formally dissolved. It simply aged in harbors. Its barges returned gradually to commercial service, its plans filed in archives that British and American intelligence officers would read in detail after the war. The question of whether Sea Lion could have succeeded, in a hypothetical where the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority, is one of the three major historiographical debates of the Battle of Britain, and it deserves a direct answer rather than a hedge. The weight of the operational research suggests probably not. Historian Basil Collier, writing in the 1962 Official History, concluded that even with full air superiority, the logistical constraints of the barge fleet made a sustained beachhead improbable. Naval historian Corelli Barnett reached a similar conclusion. The American scholar Walter Ansell, writing in the USNI Proceedings piece of January 1950, conducted the most detailed analysis of the crossing logistics and found that the first wave landing could plausibly have achieved a toehold, but that the second and third waves, arriving across a channel contested by Royal Navy forces, faced loss rates that would have made the bridgehead unsustainable. The German Army's own war game of September 1940, played at the Wehrmacht operations staff level, ended with a Red Force, British, counterattack isolating and destroying the beachhead on day 5. The result was reportedly shown to Hitler. It did not change the directive schedule because the war game was run as an internal planning exercise, not a formal go/no-go decision instrument. What the RAF's victory in the air battle actually provided was political permission for Hitler to accept what his navy had already told him was logistically impossible. Before Battle of Britain Day, there was a theoretical scenario, always thin, always contested internally, in which a broken RAF might have forced the Royal Navy to withdraw from the Channel under continuous air attack, allowing the barge fleet to cross under fighter cover. After September 15th, that scenario was gone. The RAF was not broken. Its production was accelerating. Its pilot supply, though still under strain, had stabilized. Hitler's own intuition, and several historians, including Richard Overy, have argued this point carefully, was always more interested in the East than in the island. Directive number 21, ordering planning for Barbarossa, was signed on the 18th of December 1940. Sea Lion had been on the books for 5 months. Barbarossa had been conceptualized since the summer. The timing suggests not that the Battle of Britain forced Hitler east, but that it gave him the political cover to go east without first finishing what he'd started in the west. Whether that makes the RAF's victory more or less significant is a question of framing. What the victory actually prevented was not, certainly, an invasion. What it prevented was the possibility of that thin, theoretical scenario being tested in the autumn storms of the Channel. The canal barge fleet's inadequacy as an invasion force isn't just a logistical footnote. It's an index of how much the German military machine was working on improvisation by the summer of 1940. The victories in Poland and France had been achieved by an army operating in its optimal mode. Fast, land-based, fuel supplied by captured stocks, communicating on interior lines. Sea Lion required the Wehrmacht to operate in a domain, amphibious naval assault, where it had no doctrine, no purpose-built equipment, and no institutional tradition. Every component of the crossing plan was a workaround. River barges substituting for landing craft, snorkeled tanks substituting for amphibious armor, Luftwaffe air superiority substituting for naval fire support. The British Army's American-supplied equipment was arriving through August and September, imperfectly fitted to British tactical doctrine, but real and substantial. By October, the Home Forces had received approximately 900 Bren carriers, 200 field guns, and substantial quantities of American Springfield rifles. Not ideal equipment, but functional. The window for a successful landing, if it ever existed, was probably early to mid-August, before British rearmament had progressed, before the Channel mine barriers were fully laid, and before Fighter Command had proven definitively that it couldn't be knocked from the sky in a week. By September, that window was closed. The barges were still in the harbors. The window had closed without anyone having opened it. The legacy of the Sea Lion counterfactual in British culture is worth noting briefly as a 26th century perspective. The what-if genre of Second World War alternate history has returned to the question of a German invasion of Britain dozens of times, in novels, in television series, in tabletop war games, in academic journals. The persistence of the question reflects something real about how the summer of 1940 is remembered, as a moment when everything was genuinely in the balance. But the evidence, read carefully, suggests the balance tilted against Sea Lion before the first Spitfire and Bf 109 ever met over the Channel. The RAF's victory was decisive and genuine. It was also, in the strict military sense, not the only thing preventing an invasion. It was the visible thing. The barges rotting in Rotterdam, Raiders' staff memo, the mine barriers in the Straits of Dover. These were equally decisive and almost entirely invisible to the British public watching contrails form over Kent. Public knowledge and military reality have always operated on different timelines. In the summer of 1940, the contrails were what people could see. The barges were what determined the outcome. Chapter 17. Aftermath, System, Legacy, and the Shape of Modern Air Defense. On the 20th of August, 1941, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding sat at his desk at an address outside London. He'd already been removed from Fighter Command for 9 months and signed a document that he titled simply, The Battle of Britain. It was his official dispatch, the commander's formal account of the campaign he'd directed, submitted to the Air Ministry under the standard protocol for operational dispatches from theater commanders. He was 58 years old. He'd been asked to write the dispatch, and he'd written it. The Air Ministry held it for 5 years. It was published in the London Gazette supplement of the 10th of September 1946, 6 years after the battle's official conclusion, 4 years after Dowding had retired from the RAF entirely. When it appeared, it contained a passage that has since become perhaps the most precisely self-aware paragraph any British commander has written about his own campaign. The pilot strength of Fighter Command was strained to the limit, but had the critical phase been prolonged for another fortnight, the consequences might have been grave. Might have been. The precision of that hedge is extraordinary. He'd saved the country, he'd just been fired, and the word he chose, for the margin between survival and defeat, was might. The battle's official dates, the 10th of July to the 31st of October, 1940, were established by the Air Ministry for the purposes of clasp awards to aircrew, not by any operational logic that declared the battle over on those dates. The Blitz continued until May 1941. The last major German daylight raid on Britain occurred on the 15th of September. Night bombing continued through the winter. What ended on the 31st of October was Fighter Command's sustained defensive struggle against German daylight bombing campaigns, with genuine invasion potential behind them. By that date, the RAF had lost 1,023 aircraft in Fighter Command alone, plus 376 from Bomber Command and 148 from Coastal Command. A total of 1,547 British aircraft destroyed in the official battle period. Against that, German losses, as compiled from Luftwaffe quartermaster records captured after the war, totaled 1,977 aircraft of all types, including fighters, bombers, dive bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. The asymmetry in those numbers is important. The Luftwaffe lost more aircraft than Fighter Command because British bombers and coastal aircraft were also inflicting losses on German forces throughout the period. The air battle was not only a fighter battle, it was a system. The 2,936 aircrew of Fighter Command who flew in the battle, the few, distributed their losses unevenly across the 4 months. The worst single week was the 7 days ending the 24th of August, when 68 pilots were killed or hospitalized. The cumulative deficit between losses and replacements reached its maximum around the 2nd of September, the date of Dowding's memo to the Air Council, warning that the pilot situation had become critical. Dowding's specific language survives. He used the phrase, "The situation is extremely serious." After the 7th of September, Black Saturday, the shift to London bombing, the pressure on airfields and sector stations began to ease. Not because the fighting stopped. Fighter combat over London was intense through mid-September, but the operational infrastructure, the operations rooms, the telephone landlines, the radar chain, was no longer under direct physical attack. The system that had been within days of functional collapse in early September was, by mid-September, intact and operating. The margin between those two conditions was approximately 10 days. The casualties among the few require careful disaggregation because the summary figures compress very different kinds of experience. 544 aircrew of Fighter Command were killed in the battle period, the CWGC figure, which includes Commonwealth War Grave Commission death registrations matching the official dates. 422 were wounded and returned to duty, or were permanently disabled. 104 were captured, typically pilots who bailed out over the Channel or occupied France and survived the water or the landing. Approximately 60% of Fighter Command pilots who bailed out over Britain survived to fly again. The survival rate for bailouts over the Channel was substantially lower, dependent on sea temperature, flotation equipment, and rescue timing. The average water temperature in the Channel in September 1940 was approximately 15 degrees Celsius. A pilot in flying kit without an inflatable dinghy had a survival window in the water of roughly 1 to 2 hours before hypothermia became incapacitating. The Air Sea Rescue Service, a dedicated rescue organization, was only formalized in February 1941. During the battle itself, downed pilots in the Channel were retrieved by whatever vessel was nearest. Royal Navy patrol boats, fishing vessels, civilian yachts. Some were not retrieved at all. The exact number of pilots who died in Channel water after successfully bailing out from their aircraft is not known precisely. It appears in the casualty figures only as a final tally. The water has no record book. The Dowding system that had managed those 2,936 pilots, and before them the 122 chain home stations and their operators, and before them the Observer Corps' 40,000 members, posting reports from hilltops and church towers, did not dissolve at the end of October. It evolved. The basic architecture, detection, filtering, sector control, real-time interception management, became the template for British air defense doctrine through the Cold War and into the 21st century. The RAF's current air command operates from a ground-based air defense system whose fundamental logic: gather detection data, filter it centrally, distribute control to sector stations, vector interceptors onto contacts, is recognizably descended from what Dowding, with the engineers of TRE Bawdsey and the telephone engineers of GPO, had built in 4 years between 1936 and 1940. The chain. Home stations themselves were obsolete by 1945. Radar technology had advanced so rapidly during the war that the long wavelength fixed antenna CH system was a relic by the time peace came. But the system architecture it proved in the summer of 1940 is now so fundamental to how modern air defense is organized that the conceptual debt is invisible, absorbed into doctrine, the way that a foundation absorbs into the structure built above it. The aircraft loss figures, when broken down by type and cause, reveal the actual tactical balance of the battle more clearly than the summary numbers. Of Fighter Command's 1,023 losses, approximately 62% were Hurricanes and 38% Spitfires, roughly proportional to their deployment ratios. The Bf-109E was the primary Luftwaffe fighter of the campaign. German loss records from the battle period show that approximately 60% of German aircraft destroyed were attributed to Hurricane fire and approximately 40% to Spitfire fire, though cross-examination of combat reports with Luftwaffe records shows significant overclaiming on both sides. The average RAF pilot fired approximately 15 seconds of ammunition across a typical battle sortie. The 8 Browning .303 guns in both the Hurricane and the Spitfire carried enough ammunition for approximately 14 to 16 seconds of continuous fire. Wastage rates were high. Most combats involved high-speed deflection shots at targets moving across the field of fire, not the stable pursuit engagements that harmonization settings and gun sight calibrations assumed. The effective harmonization range of 250 yards that pilots preferred, versus the Air Ministry's standard 400 yards, reflects this reality. At 400 yards, a crossing target moving at 300 miles per hour was visible in the gun sight for approximately a tenth of a second. At 250 yards, that window doubled. It still required extraordinary precision. Most bursts missed. The aircraft production context of the battle's conclusion is equally important to the analysis of what winning actually achieved. By the end of October 1940, Fighter Command's frontline strength, the number of serviceable aircraft available for operations at dawn, had risen from approximately 630 aircraft in mid-August to approximately 730. This was the effect of Beaverbrook's aircraft production program, which had, by early July, increased new aircraft output by 62% over the pre-crisis rate and repaired aircraft by 186%. The production curve crossed the loss curve in early September, the point at which more aircraft were being delivered than were being destroyed. After that crossing, time worked in the RAF's favor. The Luftwaffe, whose own production system was slower and whose pilot training pipeline produced fewer replacements per month than the RAF's, faced the inverse problem. Its frontline strength was declining relative to fighter commands from mid-September onwards. Goering's failure to recognize and respond to that production asymmetry is one of the central operational failures of the German campaign. The question of what the Battle of Britain's outcome actually meant strategically, as distinct from what it meant symbolically, is the subject of the third major historiographical debate. Richard Overy's argument, developed most fully in his 1980 study, The Battle of Britain, The Myth and the Reality, is that the battle's outcome was less decisive than it appears, because Hitler never fully committed to Sea Lion, and the invasion was logistically infeasible, regardless of the air battle's result. In Overy's reading, the RAF's victory denied Hitler a diplomatic option, the demonstration that Britain's air force could be destroyed, which might have forced Churchill to the conference table, rather than a military option. The counter-argument, made most forcefully by John Terrain and later by Sebastian Cox in his analysis of Dowding's dispatch, is that the diplomatic option and the military option were entangled. Without demonstrated Luftwaffe success in the air, Hitler had no credible threat to present to Churchill, and without that threat, the political pressure for a negotiated peace, that Churchill was already resisting from members of his own cabinet, became much easier to resist. In that reading, every day that the RAF remained operational, and the Luftwaffe losses mounted, was a day that strengthened Churchill's negotiating position against Lord Halifax's peace-feeler faction. The battle's outcome wasn't about defeating an invasion fleet. It was about creating the political conditions in which the war could continue. I want to sit with that formulation for a moment, because it does something to the conventional heroic narrative that deserves acknowledgement rather than deflection. If the battle's primary strategic significance was political rather than military, if it mattered most because of what it made possible in Churchill's cabinet room rather than what it prevented in the Channel, then the human cost of those 4 months carries a particular weight. 544 aircrew killed, 422 wounded, 2,936 total who flew, many of them 20 years old, most of them with no prior combat experience, some of them with 2 weeks of OTU training in their logbooks when they first engaged the Luftwaffe. They were not asked to prevent an invasion that may never have been possible. They were asked to demonstrate, day after day, that Britain's air force could not be broken. That demonstration, sustained through the hardest weeks of late August and early September, bought the time for production curves to cross, for Churchill's cabinet to hold, for the political reality of British non-capitulation to become undeniable. The RAF's finest hour was, in the deepest sense, an act of national will expressed through aeronautics. The machinery was extraordinary, the Dowding system was brilliant, but the underlying thing was simpler. The pilots got into the aircraft every morning and flew. The men and women who built the system that made the pilots effective, the WAAF plotters at Uxbridge and Biggin Hill and Kenley, the radar operators at Bawdsey and Dunkirk and Poling, the observer corps spotters and their hilltop posts, the ground crews who turned around hurricanes in 18 minutes, the sector controllers who vectored interceptions with 12 telephone lines where there should have been 35, are documented primarily in the aggregate. The IWM's Sound Archive holds oral testimony from approximately 60 individuals who served in support roles during the battle, and the quality of that testimony is striking for its precision. Women who recall the exact colors of plot encounters, yellow for raids over 5 minutes old, red for current, blue for projected, the feel of the telephone receiver against one ear and the background noise of the operations room in the other. The specific silence that settled over the room after a major raid had cleared, and there were no more tracks to push. Those recollections are primary sources in the strictest sense, not filtered through memoir, not reconstructed after the fact, but spoken into recording devices by people for whom the specific details were still physically present in memory. Edith Heap, a 21-year-old WAAF plotter at RAF Debden, told the IWM in a recorded interview, "We had every confidence in the pilots, and every confidence that we couldn't possibly lose." That sentence contains multitudes. It also happens to be operationally accurate. In March 2026, the Uxbridge Underground Operations Room, buried 18 meters below the ornamental garden above it, reached by 76 concrete steps, preserved exactly as it was when Churchill descended those steps on the 15th of September, 1940, can be visited by the public. The room is dark. The plotting table is there. The status board is there. The telephones are mounted on the walls where they were when WAAF plotters tracked the largest air battle the world had yet seen. Nothing in the room is replicated. The furniture, the equipment, the lighting are original. The chair at the controller's position is the same chair that Keith Park stood behind and watched his reserve squadrons disappear one by one into the air that September afternoon. Churchill, standing beside Park, turned to ask how many squadrons were still available. Park told him, "None." Every fighter in number 11 group was already airborne. The room preserved that moment across 8.5 decades, without the need for dramatization, because the moment was entirely in the furniture, the empty board, the exhausted counters, the silence of a command system that had pushed everything it had into the air and was now waiting to see if it was enough. It was enough. Just. And by margins that, reading the primary sources carefully, could easily have closed in the other direction. The margins are what the room preserves, not the victory, the margins. Was the Luftwaffe close to winning? The central historiographical dispute, dividing primarily along the question of whether the sector station damage of late August and early September constituted a genuine near defeat for fighter command. Francis K. Mason's 1969 Battle over Britain, and Derek Wood and Derek Dempster's The Narrow Margin, argue that fighter command was within days of operational collapse by early September. Richard Overy's 1980 study and subsequent work disputes this, arguing that aircraft production had already crossed the loss curve by late August, and that pilot quality, not quantity, was the real constraint, one that the 2-week OTU courses were worsening rather than solving. The primary source that most directly supports the near-collapse thesis is Dowding's own September 2nd memo to the Air Council. The primary source that complicates it is the Castle-Bromwich production data, which shows serviceable aircraft numbers rising through August, even as pilot losses mounted. Was Sea Lion logistically feasible? Basil Collier's 1962 official history concludes it was not, regardless of air superiority. Walter Ansell's USNI analysis of the barge fleet reaches the same conclusion on hydrological grounds. A minority revisionist position, associated primarily with German military historians including Karl Klee, argues that with genuine air supremacy over the Channel, the Royal Navy's surface forces would have been too vulnerable to air attack to intervene, and that the barge fleet, however unsuitable in open water, could have crossed in a compressed window of favorable weather. The majority view, sustained by post-war access to both British Admiralty and German Kriegsmarine planning records, is that the mine barriers, the destroyer force, and the geometric constraints of the barge fleet made a sustainable bridgehead improbable, even under the most favorable air scenario. Was Dowding's dismissal strategically consequential? The question is whether replacing Dowding and Park with Douglas and Lee-Mallory in November and December 1940 materially damaged Britain's defensive capability, or simply replaced one effective system with a different one. The counter-argument to the conspiracy reading, advanced by Sebastian Cox and others, is that the transition to offensive operations in 1941 required a different command culture, and that Douglas's circus operations, however costly, served the strategic purpose of keeping German fighter forces tied to the Channel coast, rather than deploying east. The counter-counter argument, documented in loss ratio data from the 41 and 42 sweep operations, is that the circus concept cost the RAF more aircraft per German aircraft destroyed than Park's defensive strategy had, and that the tying down effect was never demonstrated to have altered Luftwaffe deployment decisions. The debate remains open because both the strategic and the operational evidence are genuinely ambiguous.